It's great to see you all here. My name is Catherine Rankin. I'm a professor in the Geography and Planning Department here and the interim director of the Center for South Asian Studies. I'm convener and one of the organizers of the event, and I want to welcome you. I want to say that we will be joined in a few minutes by my colleague Rucha Birla, who's the director of the Asian Institute. And she will also say a few introductory words, and I can sneak into you the comment that we are extraordinarily fortunate at AI to have Ritu beginning her tenure as the director. She's got extraordinary. I'm introducing you.
Well, here I am
as you walk in. Extraordinary intellectual leadership, as well as the habit of entering with a flourish, who's really been amazing at pioneering a kind of bringing a critical social science and humanitarian lens to area-specific work while also exploding area-specific categories, and making sure that while we're doing area studies work, we're contributing to global conversations. Right? So, thank you for taking up the directorship. And do you want to say anything, or would you rather pass?
Well, I just want to welcome you all to the Asian Institute and to really congratulate Catherine and everyone involved in this workshop. It is really a model of what we are trying to do here at the Asian Institute. And I just want to make a comparison with our neighbors to the south, where we were trained, many of us in the United States, including Catherine and myself. See, after the Second World War, the U.S. was the global, some people would call it leader, some people call it seat of global empire. You know, it depends on your perspective. But during the Marshall Plan, the study of Asia, and indeed the rest of the world, Africa as well, was divided. It was carved up into different universities. So Cornell got certain regions of the world. Columbia, where I went, got certain regions of the world. University of Chicago got other regions of the world. Yale University got other regions of the world. And what's really exciting about being in Canada and cultivating the Asian Institute here is that we don't have that history. We don't have a history of carving up the world where different places study different things. What we have here at the Asian Institute is really, really deeply located area studies knowledge, as you will see here today. But what we also have is the possibility to produce this cross-area conversation. And that is really about opening up the very, I think, different imaginaries of what the globe means. So instead of just thinking about London and Calcutta, or thinking about Shanghai and Macau, which might actually be slightly different than London and Calcutta, we have other ways of imagining networks, pathways, conversations across the globe. And this today is such an important intervention because, as you know, Nepal is understudied, but what we're posing today, I think, as Catherine has highlighted, is not just a story about the located, situated questions about what humanitarianism is in the context of disaster. So I want to thank you all for coming to really collaborate in this new kind of conversation that we will be building at the Asian Institute. I want to really thank Catherine for putting the time and effort into creating such an important overarching set of questions to be discussed, and for inviting our wonderful faculty who work, for example, on Korea, Jennifer Chan and Ito Pang. We don't have these kinds of conversations enough. So I want to thank our faculty who are here, as well as our guests, for coming to build this. Thanks. I'm really looking forward to it.
So we have here also a wonderful collection of people. So you are academics. You are members of the diaspora community in Toronto who are, fabulously positioned in interesting professional locations in both Canada and Nepal. And we have colleagues, practitioners from humanitarian agencies based in Canada. So a wonderful mix. So So crisis and the humanitarian present is the title of what we're doing here. And I want to offer just 4 kind of contextual points that might help those of you who are not humanitarianists or Nepal experts. And one really had to do with what we've already said about our approach at the South Asia Center. So since Ritu has done that beautifully, I will skip that and say that in the spirit of what she just said, we are bringing together here on the panels anthropologists, right, with deep-seated place-specific knowledge, right, into conversations with colleagues in political science and sociology, and academics into conversation with those other groups I already just mentioned. So, and our discussants are, as has been said, are Asianists with different Asian area study expertise, but also experience and scholarship in the areas of public policy and political practice. So grateful for their willingness to help contribute to opening up the kinds of new channels for academic and other community building that Ritu mentioned. Number 2, the humanitarian present. I'm hoping that we can collectively contribute to a conversation that's going on in the literature now, and that formulation, the humanitarian present, which has been developed by scholars like Derek Gregory in geography, Didier Sassine, I.L. Weitzman in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict, was developed to capture an understanding or an analysis of the collusion of technologies of humanitarianism, right, and human rights with military and political powers. And this conversation has been really important for troubling the sort of liberal governmentality, we like to say in academia, of underlying humanitarianism. But I think that we can push that conversation in some interesting and maybe more constructive ways here. And that is by bringing in the experience and the perspective of what Catherine March is calling local social potential. Right? By that I'm referring both to the Nepali diaspora and within Nepali communities back home. So, and I think doing so for me adds to the critical analysis of liberal charity models, while also kind of engaging constructively with the opportunities for doing the work of rebuilding that global humanitarianism does actually provide, right? Okay, point number 3, why Nepal? Why is it so interesting and important, even for those of us who are not Nepal scholars? We all know about the seismic instability, and there was an earthquake in April 2015, high on the Richter scale, millions displaced. I'm not going to go through the stats. You're probably familiar with them. Since then, the monsoons wrought landslides, and a winter wrought in extreme food insecurity. But what I think is important to underscore for us is that in Nepal, humanitarian crisis derives from the ways in which seismic instability and political instability compound one another. So on the political side, we've had a civil war whose key legacy has been revolution of consciousness and a shift from a monarchy to a republican federated polity. But it took 9 years since the Civil War, or revolution, some would say, to promulgate a constitution last December. And during that time, rights for women and ethnocultural groups, ethnoculturally marginalized groups, have been gradually eroded in a regressive backlash. And now we're seeing a new kind of major disruption in the form of protests against the new constitution, which have taken the form of an unofficial blockade of petrol, as we say, and kerosene, gas, and so forth from India. So combined with the normal challenges in Nepal, like electricity shortages, daily life has been severely compounded, and these political aspects have kind of compromised the capacity to undertake development projects, let alone rebuilding, right? Okay, so these two dimensions of the crisis, which are usually looked at in isolation, right, compound one another and create the humanitarian disaster that we'll talk about. And I think the Nepal case is important for underscoring this relationship between political and seismic instability. For last point, why Nepal, kind of point B, is that there's also this kind of incredible, energizing creativity that comes with disruption, right? And even that of a humanitarian disaster. And here the flourishing of kind of grassroots, do-it-yourself relief and rebuilding is another dynamic that's often overlooked in accounts of humanitarianism and crisis. And that I think we can take here today. This is a key goal for the day as a resource, both theoretically and practically. So I want to say that the Toronto-based network called ASA, which translates as Hope, ASA Toronto, is one such site of creative response. It was formed the week after the earthquake, actually right here at the Munk School, at a fundraiser breakfast, which was kindly hosted by the Asian Institute. That prompted I think the city's first ever sit down across the table, face-to-face meeting among Nepal scholars, diplomats, diaspora members, Nepali associations, and so forth, to share information. That spawned ASA Toronto, which through a web of sort of uncoordinated initiatives has ended up making quite impressive contributions to fundraising. And I'll count myself as a member. We also began to hold regular meetings right here in this room, featuring Skype conversations with colleagues in Nepal. We had quite the social networks to the political, the private, and civil society sectors. With colleagues in Nepal who are on the front lines, right, of relief efforts, of social audits of the relief efforts, even of the banking sector response. So we kind of sought to inform ourselves in a way that would not have been possible through normal media channels or our own individual connections to friends and family. And we also sought to contribute to public discussions in Canada. So first through an interview on CBC's Metro Morning with Manjushree Thapa, who's a panelist today. And at this event, which is co-sponsored by ASA Toronto, our aim is to kind of explicitly scale up these interventions and conversations, right? Cross-regionally and also by engaging all of you. And I want to underscore that doing this is also intended to center the collaborative relationship, right, between a university area studies program and a diaspora community. And I'm saying that because I think we're doing it in a way that can trouble a little bit the relationship that usually develops between those two groups. Like the latter, the diaspora, is usually a research subject of the former, the university. And we're hoping to not, well, we're not doing that. Okay, and I think continuing on that fourth contextualizing point about local social potential, you'll hear a lot today about that concept in Nepal. So I won't say much more about it than to say extraordinary, similarly based on social networks, initiative and capacity to secure supplies, funds, medical and engineering expertise, and all kinds of other responses to the humanitarian crisis that might we can rival more institutionalized and long time kind of experience channels. And I want us to do so without kind of celebrating resilience, right? Resilience as grounds for releasing the state from its responsibilities to citizens. Okay. So I think we need to explore this sort of local social potential as a key way of rethinking crisis and the humanitarian present. So we'll aim to do that in two ways. And now I'll tell you a little bit about the plan for the day. There's a handout, if you want to pick it up as well, that summarizes this. Until lunch, we'll hear panel presentations from Nepal specialists with commentary by our other Asian Institute colleagues. Two panels, two papers on each panel. The first panel is titled Fissures and Solidarities, which is intended to capture that kind of tension between the regressive and progressive possibilities in this conjuncture of federation and rebuilding. And the second panel, which starts at 11:30, is titled A Role for Critical Social Science, ? As a way to kind of enter into an argument that the humanitarian present is contingent, right? It's contingent, and there are more possible futures than we are kind of routinely encouraged to see. So we'll break for lunch, and those of you who have registered will reconvene for a 2-hour workshop on strategies for promoting aid accountability. And there the goal is to bring, explicitly to bring the academic, diaspora, and humanitarian agency communities into a kind of structured dialogue. So we'll build in ample time for breaks, including in between the panels, to kind of achieve that goal more informally. And we can start now, but I need to, one more preface, which is to say that like any truly collaborative venture, there are a lot of thank yous to share. And so I will do that now. Thank you to the event's co-sponsors, ASA Toronto, the Dr. David Chu Program in Asia Pacific Studies, Department of Geography and Planning, Center for the Study of Korea, the East Asia Seminar Series, and the Asian Institute. Gives you a sense of all the cross-fertilization that goes on here. To the extraordinary event planning staff at AI, and I see Rachel Ostap is not here, but please give her thanks if you see her dressed in black. And to the ASA Toronto Organizing Committee, which helped kind of think through and execute the design of the day. I will name them: Pushpa Acharya, Pushpa Hamal, Elsie Lewison, Nikunja Nepal, Sabine Ningleku, Yogendra Shakya, and Sarah Zendel. And finally, is someone here from TIFF?
TNFF, yeah.
Sorry, TNFFs. I want to make the announcement about the upcoming Toronto Nepali Film Festival, which is the largest film festival outside Nepal. And to let you know that the date, time, and venue is, just give us the date, time, and venue.
It's March 19th and March 28th.
Yeah.
And the venue is in East Town Hall right here. And we have another one in Mississauga.
Okay, March 20th.
March 19th.
Oh, sorry, March 19th. So, and for our purposes, I wanted to emphasize that it will feature an award-winning film on the earthquakes called Byagyali Bacheka Haru. Byagyali Bacheka Haru. And there's an English also version of the title, Nepal Earthquake Hero Survivors and Miracles, which is being co-sponsored by Alpha. Okay, so we should start. And I'm looking for my timepiece. We're going to segue directly into the first panel, and for that I need introductions of the speakers. To my left, Catherine March, who is a professor of anthropology, feminist gender, sexuality studies, and public affairs at Cornell. She's been working in Nepal since 1973 and is was my undergraduate thesis advisor, as well as member of my doctoral committee. So her work is largely on Tibeto-Burman Himalayan groups, on and with, I should say. Her most recent book is titled If Each Comes Halfway, published by Cornell University Press, and it's an engagement with women's life history narratives and song compositions. But Kath has also been very active in kind of institution building and in advisory capacity development work. She's worked with UNFAO, among many other both international and Nepali agencies and ministries. And most recently, she's played this extraordinary role, which you'll hear about in brokering support for rebuilding and kind of navigating the fraught terrains of humanitarianism. So her talk title is Failure in Nepal, Seismicity, the State and the Local. Speaker number 2 will be Manjushri Thapa, who is a Toronto-based writer and leader of public initiatives to engage literature and the arts as an arena of political activism, engagement in Nepal. She's the author of 3 nonfiction books, the most recent of which is Forget. Am I right? No? The Lives We Have Lost, of course. As well as books of fiction, Seasons of Flight, Tilled Earth, and my favorite is titled The Tutor of History. And she's translated the work of more than 50 Nepali writers into English. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times and the London Review of Books, in various Toronto publications, and others in North America and South Asia. And her next novel is titled All of Us in Our Own Lives, will be published in spring 2016. So we've all been waiting. Munch's writing is stunning. You know, it's elegant, it's moving, and it's theoretically rich, and most importantly, it's political. And for us, it expresses this kind of, for us here today, this kind of ethic of answerability. That's a term you can figure out and work with. So kind of giving direct expression to Nepali voices, while also deeply troubling kind of liberal formulations of democracy and development, humanitarianism. Her talk title, Manjushri Thapa's, is Cognitive Dissonance, Narrative Incoherence, Nepal's Story. Discussing will be Professor Jennifer Chun, who is director of the Center for the Study of Korea here at Munk, and a sociologist. Jennifer is the author of the book titled Organizing at the Margins, The Symbolic Politics of Labor in South Korea and the United States, also Cornell University Press, which won the American Sociological Association's Race, Gender, and Class Sections Distinguished Book Award in 2012. Her current work is on protesting publics in South Korea, and Jennifer is just an amazing colleague, right, who's been instrumental in building a kind of vibrant, cross-disciplinary, comparative intellectual conversation here at UT. So thank you, and let's proceed. You each have about 25, 30 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ritu. Thank you, Catherine. Thank everyone for being here. It really is a pleasure to think about doing this. Pleasure is a mixed metaphor in this case, but it's having the opportunity to try to think through things that are very complicated and very personally tense for me is very, very useful. I want to, when Catherine talks about my enthusiasm for local social potential, I want to make it very clear that this is going to be a discussion of how entangled that local social potential is, and that if not absolutely interrupted by much larger forces of international I usually just refer to it as disaster capitalism, but certainly there's the militarism in there as well. At the international level, of disaster profiteering and consolidation of privilege at the national level, and just disaster full stop at the local level. This is really an attempt to look at the ways in which the tensions and the deep historical, cultural, and political tensions between localities, very particular localities throughout Nepal, of which I'm only going to be speaking of one, and these larger forces. Basically, it's a story of extraordinarily good people caught in extraordinarily destructive structures. And so with that, the locality is pretty easy. Anthropologists can't not describe where it is. This is an area that's actually very close to Kathmandu. You can see it from Ranipawa. It's one ridge, a freestanding ridge, that is caught on the edge of the Trisuli River. And so what my story is about the impact of the 2015 earthquakes and their efforts to recover from them in this very specific locality. It's a story that both looks back into the history and beyond, into the region, into the state and international practice. It's actually not a very pretty story. It chronicles, albeit only partially, given the very great constraints of time, the human abuses of a magnitude far greater than that of the recent earthquakes, devastating though they were. And it is a tribute to the spirit, creativity, energy, and resilience, a very troubled word, as Catherine has already indicated, of the people, mostly Tamang, who inhabit Pukri Ridge, which is the name of this ridge that, as all of you I'm sure know, the districts of Nuakot, Dading, and Rassawa at one time were all a region called West Number 1. Subsequently, the whole of Pukri Ridge was part of Rassawa district, and then sometime early in the 70s, if anyone knows exactly when, that would be appreciated, they were split into two districts, which further complicates the story in ways that I want to talk about. The earthquake interrupted life there very dramatically, and it is foremost on everyone's minds. I made a trip back in October to see people. Everyone who had a smartphone had snippets of images. Everyone had a story to tell. And interestingly, even more than the stories of shaking and collapsing of buildings were stories of dust, clouds and clouds of dust. It's a story that in some ways is very similar to the stories told in other parts of Nepal, and yet in other ways is completely unique to this particular ridge. In particular, the biggest takeaway for me when I returned to Nepal in September and October to November, was how fortunate really people had been, and I'm thinking of your documentary title. We all know the timing, both in terms of day of the week and time of the day, meant that actually very few people died, but the structural devastation was nearly total in this area. People desperately needed help, and help did come. It was in the form, on the ridge, it was almost entirely in the form, as it has been noted by many other people, of do-it-yourself. However, I'd like to specify that in this area, at least, that do-it-yourself help came in from three directions. Part of it, and the one that is often most widely discussed, are non-Nepalese descended expatriates, foreign individuals, INGOs, and so forth. Oh my God, this is an earlier version of this talk. All right. Also, in this area, the role of diasporic Nepalese was very, very important. 2/3 of the men and boys of working age no longer live in the village to work, and half of those are out of the subcontinent. As many of those as could come home came home, and they all have been even further intensifying their efforts to send funds home. Finally, there is the role that has also been well discussed in civil society. Among the expatriates, it's important to note that there were in this village about half of the aid that came from expatriates who were not descended of the village came, here's particularity for you, from Malaysia, for reasons that I won't go into, but have to do with trekking-related affiliations. And I would guess that there are probably similarly particular accounts of relief from other places. And in civil society, in this area, the bulk of the relief did not come from the much touted youth movements and things like that. It came, in fact, from Buddhist society, a Buddhist society located in the Terai, in the region of Lumbini. So there's a lot that I think we've sort of rushed a little bit too fast to come to conclusions about the DYI. I think it requires much finer analysis than it is. There's no question, however, that the government of Nepal, this is evidence from their own figures, which I think are terribly, terribly problematic, in terms of, and this one just compares the red descent, which is how the graph is organized, shows the districts, the affected districts, in terms of the number of deaths, right? And the black shows the distribution of rice relief. I call your attention particularly to Rassawa, the far left one, and Nuakot, the fourth most serious in terms of death and the relative absence of rice relief. This is government rice relief. This does not count well, it's not clear how much it counts the DIY stuff. But notice also, Lalitpur, Kathmandu, and Bhaktapur did not particularly, even though they're very close, get lots of help from the government. Death may not be the best measure because, as I said, death is not necessarily the right measure. Oh God, this is an earlier version. I would really like to put my computer in. All right. If you look at house destruction, all right, which is another form of measure, and look at rice distribution, or if you look at house destruction and tent tarp distribution, the only takeaway that you can make is that the statistics are really junk, and secondly, that there is no apparent logic or region and rationale. And this, you need to remember that overall, the second biggest takeaway is the total distribution of relief from the government of Nepal was utterly inadequate. That a district of Nuakot would get, 11 kilograms of rice per capita, 4 tents per 1,000 fully destroyed homes. When people talk about the failure of the government to come in, they're talking. They're not lying. There's even the government's own reported figures show very inadequate relief. Over in this area, 1.5 times as much relief came in the DYI in all of its various forms, than came from the all government sources combined. All right. This is the wrong version, you guys. Can I put my? It's in my computer. David, can I have my computer? Yeah. Yeah, I'm really sorry, but this is going to make us go over time if I do that. Okay, disconnect here. Thank you. Yeah. This has to be the toggle. There's a toggle in. Kathy, Catherine? There's a toggle in that front packet. They've now made it so that even PCs have to have toggles.
It might be a good to ask who was there during the earthquake.
Who was there?
In this room? Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. I left 10 days before.
So just for three.
During.
Where were you?
1, 2, 3,
Where were you?
I was there during the second earthquake in Kathmandu.
Huh, wow.
And
Wow.
we're in Kathmandu? Anybody else? And where were you? And also there?
Aftershocks count?
Aftershocks, yeah. There was one that was almost 5. Yeah,
Okay,
just
aftershocks, Sabine?
They count, they were just terrifying.
All right, I want to turn this off. You know how to do that backwards?
How many people have been in Nepal since
Yeah,
April?
we'll probably turn off the wireless quickly. Do you know?
Turn off?
Yeah,
It is not. Yeah, it is on.
but no, it's not.
And how many
It's
people
trying.
work in the humanitarian sector?
I think it just is searching, but it's not
Okay,
connected.
yeah, I know, but it'll probably interrupt us. Okay. All right, let's try again. Let's see if I can do this better now. I hope I didn't overwrite. No, this is right. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Sorry, folks.
It took 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, you did. These 30 seconds matter here. There we go. Okay. So looking at they're saying that there's no good correlation. I'm going to move forward two more. All right. Now, some of this I'm just going to run up here, and I don't want to discuss because it is a whole lot of information that we're all familiar with. For me, part of putting this, hello? Yeah, there we go. Part of putting this together was to assemble from all my notes and things, assemble information, and so the absence, the failure of government at the local level in all respects is an important part of the story. At the national level, the kinds of things that Catherine referred to in terms that I would coalesce around the concerns about party politics and partisan disputes, especially with the continued tension over how inclusive or exclusive the state will be. And I want to add just one small discussion which hasn't been done, but which I regard as a particular failure, a particular version of failure. And I'm able to do this because the Cornell Library has digitized the entire national school curriculum textbooks back into the 30s, at least all the ones we could get hold of, and we're happy to look for more. So I went to look at these school books to see what they said about earthquakes, and the answer is nothing. These school books, science is very, very poorly taught in the school books. There are two parts of the science curriculum. One is called the actual science curriculum, and except for very, very little bits of things, it teaches science as if humans had nothing to do with it. And in particular, with respect to the earthquake, it is a list of definitions, the worst possible map you could imagine of the world, which if you happen to get a well-printed copy of the textbook, you might notice that there's a fault line that goes through Nepal. In the health curriculum, by contrast, and this is important to notice, by contrast, the health curriculum, still just as poorly pedagogically organized and is almost unintelligible, nevertheless includes information about how to build water filters and how to build latrines. The only information that I was able to come across in terms of earthquake preparedness systematically, and maybe there'd be a show of hands here because some of you, if you were being educated in Nepal at the time, would have experienced it. UNICEF ran a nationwide earthquake preparedness program of the drop, cover, and hold on variety, which if you were lucky enough to be in the right grade and at school on the right day that it came to your locality, you got to hear it. And then you might have been unlucky enough to be one of the many stories of children who ran back into buildings when the earthquake occurred because that was how they understood what. In the face of this, I took leave from my job and perhaps my senses to go back to the Ridge to try to develop a comprehensive program. It has three components, assembling the interlocking concerns of rebuilding, increasing access to money, and expanding the infrastructural support for those activities. And the two components that I did while I was in Nepal, one was to this what I'm calling a demonstration rebuild project, and the one that is happening now is the rebuilding of the second of the community buildings. This starts, as does all my work and all my commitments, in discussions with people all over the ridge about what happened, what was happening, what was needed. It was a totally different experience for me, much more intense from in a different way from the kind of field work I'm used to doing. It involved a lot more riding on motorcycles. I've decided that Nepal should give up cricket and football and go straight for motocross. Just,
Extreme sport.
extreme sports. The Cornell program that is being developed is heavily influenced by the ILO Convention 169 with respect to indigenous rights to articulate a framework through which community rights in the process are explicitly articulated and appropriate outsider roles and responsibilities are also equally articulated. And the basic tenet of this is that outsiders are in service of local needs and interests and organizations. Now that's a little too nice because not all local institutions are nice. And so it has to include a component of assessing what kinds of institutions would be appropriate for producing transparent and equitable construction work. And that's another very long story, which there isn't time for. I will say that what I have never been quite so struck before, because in this case, the reconstruction work required working with various aspects of the government. Previously, as an anthropologist working on the ridge with David Holmberg, who is also here, he has written about the ways that Tamang on the ridge became an involuted community, that in a sense they strategically cut themselves off from the state to have as much local autonomy as possible. And that simply is not possible in order to do this kind of reconstruction. And the first and most important thing to note about what's happened in this area is of the 6 administrative VDCs on the ridge, 4 are now in the district of Nuakchot and 4 are in Rasuwa. Similarly, none of the VDCs represent natural social units. They contain varying numbers of natural villages within them. Some of them split villages, and it's a totally nonsensical way to organize local development. Indeed, I think you could almost make a case that it is a form of very politicized gerrymandering designed to prevent local organization over shared interests and needs. The greatest need at the local level by everyone, because everyone lost their house, even people whose houses were standing are going to have to tear them down. And paradoxically, of course, the government is offering less money if you have to first demolish and then rebuild. So this was most important on people's minds. They were very frustrated with the aid that they had received, and in particularly, be careful what you take with you, protested the abundance of toothbrushes. One of the things that I had to do on this travel around was I had, in my excursions through the offices in Kathmandu and worked through OCHA at that time in the shelter cluster as part of their reconstruction efforts, had advanced copies of what later was released by the government as plans to assist reconstruction. And as I made a handout, it's my first handout on the mountain ever, of those instructions in Nepali for those people who could read them on the hill. And you could just feel the ripples go through these meetings as people realizing that this meant this wasn't going to be meaningful to them, that it was too late, too little, too complicated. It just was not, and it wasn't going to reach them. All right, and so these conversations with people identified lots of issues that are now pretty widely discussed. I want to talk about one that was discussed that I think is a little less widely identified, and that is the designs themselves. All right, the Department of Urban Planning and Building Construction has since 1988 had a has had a manual for earthquake-resistant construction, and it has pages like this. I am thrilled that the people that almost a third of the people over the age of 5 on the ridge now are marginally literate, but there's no way they could understand that, all right?
And it's only in English, right?
As far as I know, it's only been, does anybody know? As far as I know, it's only been released. It wasn't released when I was there. It was still sitting on his shelf. Had been sitting on his shelf since 1988, okay? But the interesting thing, so there's some of the things that's interesting. People, when I took an advanced copy of it up there. This is another version of the good people in crappy positions. The deputy director of the DUP BC was extraordinarily helpful. He let me have copies of this stuff. He let me take it. You know, he helped me get permits to do all this kind of thing. And when I took them up, people were very pleased. This is just one example. There are like 50 designs. The Japanese architects who consulted on the construction of this knew about vernacular architecture, and they did a beautiful job on the outside. And on the inside, if you will note, it designates a veranda, kitchen, a bedroom, right? This is not exactly the way rural people live. And one of the things the media has made a great deal about the need for funding house reconstruction because winter is coming. Everybody watched the Game of Thrones, right? Well, it's come, and this certainly means that people are suffering. But locals were more concerned about their crops than they were about themselves. Now that's assuming you had enough blankets and a few other things, which not everybody did. But there is no provision for grain storage in any of the government designs. Repurposing the designs, well, okay, I'm going to run out of time if I go too far.
10 minutes, minus 2.
Okay. Since people were going to rebuild, one of the things that it became clear that I should do with the money that I had crowdsourced was to provide earthquake-resistant construction training. And so I worked with, again, amazing group of people. There are several, and I can talk to you about all of the different people who are working in earthquake-resistant construction. I was very specific in the needs. It had to be mud-bonded stone masonry using local materials, which is that's a very high, that's hard to make earthquake resistant, but it is possible. So the people from the School for Shelter and the Environment, who have been in business since 1987, all right, came up to do a training up here, and in the process built one small community building, which the community will be using as a community cookhouse and guest house. These are terrible pictures. I just got them actually 2 nights ago in an SMS message. This training funded the training of 30 people, 5 from each of the 6 VDCs selected by the community, and they did an astonishing job of making, if you could read all the names here, and I could show it to you, they did an astonishing job of making those 30 representative of the demographics of the ridge. The demographics are about 2/3 ethnic, and indeed, unlike the schools and unlike any other undertaking I've ever seen, this is 2/3 ethnic. There's a slight overrepresentation of Dalit. And there are still a few Brahmin Chetris in there, okay? I mean, it was spectacular. They are embarked now in the process of rebuilding the Women's Community Center. All right? Now, here's the part. This is all of this, and all of the pieces of it that I can't tell because there's not enough time, is a story with a seriously mixed message. Rarely have hope and despair been so entangled, and the state and the local in this area. I want to close by returning to some of the lessons of history as it has shaped life, especially for the Tamang on Pukri Ridge and the surrounding region. For in this regard, the toll of the Gurkha earthquake, that donut, is very sadly reminiscent of the toll of the Gurkha conquest. All right? Both, in fact, had their epicenter, if you will like, in Barpak. that Gale, Tamang, Tamu community that was so infamously deceived by early Shaw conquests. Both were most seriously decimated in that donut of destruction, or shell roti, if you want that as your metaphor. With the lands and peoples devastated by forces bearing down upon them from the west, over which they had no control, and in the face of which those who controlled the political, cultural, religious, and linguistic center had very little empathy. One of the Kathmandu colleagues who was trying to explain why most of the good tents stayed in the Kathmandu Valley explicitly said, well, it's because those people know how to live in sheds and we don't. All right? And I have, for those of you who want to look at the whole of it, I have a Google Earth movie, which you can find probably just by Googling my name, but it traces the conquest of the Shah kings to try to show you just exactly how the path of that conquest and the path of earthquake destruction, it's one map. It's one map. All right? But I'm not going to show it all here. It's too much fun. This created the historical Gurkha soldiery, and it created a very centralized, patrimonial, culturally and religiously homogeneous Khas Parbatya polity, which told itself, in the words of Pratyush Onta, noble narratives of a brave Bir conquest, all right, which at the local level were distinctively exclusionary and extractive. With respect to conquered communities, in processes beginning with the early Shah kings and intensifying through the period of Rana rule, when land grants and tenancy rents became really excessive, and myriad forms of corvée labor imposed most intensely upon precisely the indigenous populations encircling the Kathmandu Valley. I would love to know a little bit about Kathmandu Valley Japu in this regard. I mean, I don't know, but that's something, if you don't have your thesis topic yet. And established a unique form of governmental administration in which no one was paid a salary or much of a salary, and instead government posts were something that elites competed for and even bid for because they conferred almost unrestricted rights to skim some sort of resource, customs, forest, and water being among the greatest historic and contemporary examples, whereby whoever had the Sarkar, and it doesn't matter which Sarkar we're talking about, seal of approval, could extract whatever duties they wanted to, even on the earthquake relief goods, in exchange for transmitting some percentage of their extraction to those above them in the hierarchy of elite resource capture. But only for a year at a time. All right, so it's even crazier than that. These rights had to be renewed traditionally each year at Dasein, which made everyone simultaneously excessively exploitive of those below them and excessively obsequious to all of them above them. All right? So when people ask me, why are the Tamang on Pukri Ridge so poor if they live so close to Kathmandu? To which I answer, they are so poor because they live so close to Kathmandu. And again, part of this is my effort to keep a record. This is a timeline of the infamous National Reconstruction Authority, which, as we all know, took 7 months to become even marginally operational. Its major operations to date, as nearly as I can tell, has been a failed campaign to design a logo and a ramato, and a ban on the use of funds for reconstructing Buddhist temples. All right. This systematic legacy of the history of Nepalese administrative practice with no authorized local governments, with central authorities able to claim absolute rights over all national resources, has produced one of the most persistent forms of revenue farming known, in which state agents accumulated wealth by dipping their hands into whatever revenue stream they had been given the right to administer. This stands in stark contrast to, and I'm returning particularly to the idea of reconstruction, to many magnificent designs and efforts to develop earthquake-resistant construction. And again, you can chase this one down on the internet. It's beautiful. The guys who did this are they're just brilliant. I am, okay. Compare this to the government's design catalog, now finally released, as far as I know, only in English, in which I want just to say that the earthquake sent shockwaves across Nepal that permanently altered the natural landscape, but it was the human hands that did and did not respond quickly and or appropriately enough that will continue to ripple through, and here's my prediction, many years in the future as displaced persons added to conflict displaced persons, both internally and internationally, increase. I also want to share with you the prevalent talk on the ridge of coming famine. They do not see how they're going to be able to keep this year's crops safe from rot, from mildew, and from monkeys. And of course, to sound warnings to all of you who work particularly in Western Nepal, that now is the time to build reinforcements. So thank you very much.
Kat. So we'll move right into Manjushri Papa. Why don't you come around?
I'm going to turn this on. Okay, I will indeed. I'm going to give her her.
And as they shift around, we'll then follow with Jennifer's comments. We'll discuss until 11 and then allow Jennifer to run out and go teach her class. Maybe we can eat a little bit into the half-hour time for another 10 minutes if there's still comments that people want to make in response.
Is that in? Yes.
And thank you for reminding us that an understanding of the humanitarian present must also be historicized.
Thank you, Kath, for that amazing presentation. Thank you, Ritu and Catherine, for inviting me to be here. I am not an academic. I'm a practitioner, so I'm a little out of place, but I'm going to describe to you a sort of struggle for narrative control that I think a lot of people are engaged in Nepal, and talk about what's happened to the story of Nepal particularly in the period from 2006 to now, which is when the nation sort of collectively embarked on this process of national reimagining and wanted to come up with a new story about what Nepal was about. So I've spoken before, about at the Munk Center about literature and how much the history of Nepal's literature often speaks very poignantly to the history of a country that's constantly been moving towards progressive values and constantly held back. So at different times in Nepal's history, we've had various writers who really have sort of captured the zeitgeist of the era and using the logic of that era. So whether it was during the Rana period, it was Leknath Baujel or Yogamaya talking about, with a more sort of caste-based or religious logic, that was still a progressive voice for its time. Or whether we're going to talk later about Lakshmi Prasad Devkota, who was also a very progressive voice. Bhupi Sherchan, very progressive voice. So and Bhupi Sherchan, had this iconic poem called "The Blind Man in a Revolving Chair," which described the conundrum of Panchayat, sort of an absolute monarchy being led by these sort of blind leaders. To after 1990, where we've had a generation more now of writers who have been basically not directly politically, but through their work, indirectly supporting the expansion of citizens' rights and democratic values. So I think the history of Nepali literature has consistently been a voice of progress in Nepal. And of course, there's, always when we're talking about narrativizing a nation, we're always going to be talking about competing narratives. And there's a lot of competition right now in Nepal about trying to control the narrative, trying to explain to Nepali citizens what's going on, and also explain to the outside world what's going on. And as a writer and also, as I said, a practitioner who participates in this contestation, and I do see my task as a writer as someone who narrativizes Nepal in such a way to highlight the values that I think are important, more progressive values. So I think it's very important to look at what the prevailing narratives of the day are and to see who they're serving. And in that, there are the noisier voices and there are the quieter voices. And I'm going to look at two arenas, the noisier voice, which is the media voice and the public sphere, and the quieter voice, which is the literary sphere, which I think mainly because it gets absolutely no funding is quieter. and maybe there's a blessing in that. So this era of national reimagining, 2006 to now, where we were supposed to get a new story of Nepal, has instead, as we see, turned into an era of sort of bitter polarization, and after that with the earthquake and then with the promulgation of a controversial constitution, a sort of growing disaster. I want to talk, so in terms of literature, turning my attention to that, I want to talk first about a very small point which I think is always really important to remember is Nepal is hugely multilingual, and even after all these years of Nepali being the state language and being the language instruction of government, of public discourse, it is only the mother tongue of less than 50% of the population. And I think that's a really important thing to always remember, because the 1990s and after that have been an era of identity-based civil rights movements, and one component of it has been the language rights movement and the reassertion of language and the sort of revitalization of language. And so it's really important when we talk about Nepali literature to not use Nepali to mean the Nepali language, but as the Nepali national languages. The second point I want to make is that the Nepali language is the language of state power in Nepal, as Kath March pointed out. It's the language of those who have historically held power in Nepal, so the Khas sort of ruling caste and the sort of courtly castes and the Brahminical sort of priestly castes. So this has been, if you look at, I'm going to encourage, if you haven't seen the movie Sherpa, you see a very interesting thing where there's a group of not Sherpas but porters, and they're negotiating. This is on Everest a few years ago when they were having problems with the sort of dangers that they were being pressed to climb through, and they were protesting and they wanted more safety. And so the language that a lot of the porters were Rai and a few Sherpa and Tamang, they're using the vernacular Nepali, which is, in the Nepali language, there are almost two separate ways of using language. The spoken language is very vernacular and informal, whereas written Nepali is very formal and high and Brahminical Sanskritic. And I certainly have the experience of reading Nepali newspapers and not understanding them, or struggling. It's a level of learning that you need of the language that's very high. So in this movie, you suddenly see, when the government officials come and the porters need to talk to the government officials, you suddenly see their language elevating into this language of power, into this very high Sanskritic sort of language, which I think is a very interesting thing. It's certainly the case that in Nepali literature, until the 1990s, it was all written in this high language. And I remember having some very funny and awkward conversations with Nepali writers during the 1990s and afterwards about how it was really odd that dialogue in all Nepali literature, even if it's villagers who are talking, is very flowery and literary and sort of high. Since then, particularly with the arrival of Kagandar Sangrola's novel Junkiriko Sangit around 2003 at the height of the Maoist movement, there's been a huge democratization in written Nepali and a sort of injection of the vernacular and also English and sort of bastardized language into written Nepali, which I think has made Nepali literature a lot more accessible, combined with another very important sign of the democratization of Nepali language is the eradication of the fifth and highest form of address, sarkar, from public sphere after the abolition of monarchy in 2008. So we've basically got a language that is moving towards more democracy and more openness and accessibility in its literary form. So I want to start, to talk about 2006, I want to start with a poem by Shravan Mukarung, a poet, and it's a poem that became the sort of battle cry for the people's movement of 2006, which launched this era of looking for a new constitution. It's called Bise Nagarchi's account. Bise Nagarchi was Prithvi Narayan Shah, the founder of Nepal's tailor, and it's a poem that sort of captured the zeitgeist of the 2006 movement. King Gyanendra had just taken over when this was first recited. I'll just read two passages from it. It's called Bise Nagarchi's account. Master, the Lodem, why have they suddenly shriveled? These decent and dignified people, why are they bleeding and bent? Why has the Dorondi turned around to flow uphill? Why do I see the palace in fragments? I've gone mad, I've gone mad. Master, does your sword now chop heads or petals? I've been mistaken. Does your rifle shoot down dreams or people? I've been mistaken. Did your subjects make this kingdom or you? I've been mistaken. Master, I've been with you 250 years. How can I be a terrorist? I've gone mad, Master, mad. It's a much longer poem, but it sort of captures this moment where suddenly you could question the state and the very founding of the Nepali state, and this assumption that the Shah dynasty or any monarchy was at the very center of Nepali identity. Suddenly you could question it through the voice of the Dalit tailor, who in our history books played a very supportive role to the Gorkha conquest. So there was a kind of national, after Shravan Mukarung read this in public, recited it in public, there was a kind of national consensus around this poem that this was the poem of the movement. And it sort of was championed by everyone, by all political actors involved in the 2006 movement. And when you heard it, its sort of sympathetic chords reverberated with the crisis of the present moment, which is that a king had taken power yet again, unbelievably. And I think it reverberated for two reasons. I mean, I always wonder what made this poem so iconic, while there were many other poems expressing similar values and similar expressions. And I think the first thing is that all of the parties were united against the king, so they were looking for something that they could all rally around. And it was a rare moment of unity among the political parties. And a second and even more important factor, I think, is that this poem basically implies, implicit in it is the value of inclusion. The fact that a Dalit tailor can say, did your subjects make this kingdom or did you? Which is something that, is quite a revolutionary expression, or was at that time. So this value of inclusion, I think, is where it sort of reverberated with the moment. And I believe that the 2006, the moment we're in right now, and the struggle since 2006 has been around the concept of inclusion. So this term, inclusion, which is a very awkward word in Nepali, samaveshikaran, again very high in Sanskritic. I'm not sure how many people who aren't educated highly in the Nepali language understand it or really feel its spirit. It was basically a term introduced, as many terms are into Nepal, from the outside, I would say around the early 2000s, to articulate the aspirations behind what had been these growing civil rights movements in Nepal. So if you look at the Dalit rights movements, the women's rights movement, Janjati rights movement, and the Madhesh rights movements, these are all in various forms found their beginnings in 1950, but really had sort of come into their own after 1990. And, the aid world had sort of responded to that with a shift to rights-based development, since it was a democracy trying to help people expand their democratic rights within the state, democratic state. And these movements had also come specifically to articulate this demand for inclusion. And I believe that, you know, this word came about with a sort of synergy between the civil rights movements and the aid world. It was not, as many now are claiming, introduced by the aid world or foisted upon Nepal. I believe that it really came out of the civil rights movements and was just a term that did come from outside, but it captured this moment and this aspiration or desire on the part of the 85% of Nepal's population who have not found space in the state power structure. So I think that when Nepal launched on its project of coming up with a new constitution, a new story of itself, the aspiration was that this constitution was going to tell the story of a very inclusive Nepal, a completely different Nepal from the past, which has been so exclusive that only 15% of the population, and as we know, that's Chetri, Brahmin, Hill men, and even within that, a few families of those, so of which I'm also one. So a very small and exclusive group has held power. So the story of exclusivity was going to end, and the story of inclusion was going to begin. And as we know, anyone who's been following the struggle over the constitution drafting, the bitterest fights have been around this issue of inclusion, and specifically around the mechanisms by which all of the actors in the civil rights movements, the various civil rights movements, the mechanisms they wanted to ensure that inclusion would happen. So these were reservations, federalism, and the issue of both the boundaries of the federal powers of the new provinces, proportional representation, and citizenship or equality in terms of citizenship. Now, it's interesting. I believe it was Catherine said, it's been a long search for this new constitution. It does feel like it's been, I think, since we're living through it, it feels like time is creeping. It's been 9 years. It was 9 years between the peace process and the time of getting a constitution, which isn't long and also feels extremely long. It was certainly long enough, I think, for the establishment, sort of led by the traditional cause, Nepali language empowered community to stage a real pushback. So I think the main thing that has happened since 2006, but particularly 2008 after the electoral victory of the Maoists, that there's been a very concerted pushback, and the political alliance against the king, which had united all of the political parties, broke apart with the election for the Constituent Assembly, and certainly after the victory of the Maoists to the Constituent Assembly. So the kind of larger national consensus which had allowed everyone to rally around a poem like Shravan Mukharum's basically dissipated, and everyone went into their corners to fight the fight as they saw it from their corners. So after 2008, I remember this very distinctly, the term inclusion itself became contested by the establishment, primarily by those affiliated with the Congress and UML. They not only distanced themselves from the term, they even took umbrage at it and labeled those who were demanding inclusion and the civil rights movements communal. And so I think that, it was an interesting moment because there was a sudden shift where, without looking at the communal nature of the state and state power, suddenly those who were demanding inclusion were put on the back foot and made to defend themselves as people who believed in inclusion, but they were constantly being attacked about how inclusive are they in their own groups, which is also an important question, but so being made to defend themselves against this charge of communalism. And so there were other indications of the pushback. I think the government's refusal to renew the mandate of UNMIN, the United Nations mission in Nepal in 2011, was a very crucial moment of pushback because UNMIN had been seen as an intervention that aided in bringing inclusion to the fore and helping the Maoists win the election. it was seen that way by the establishment. The government also increasingly hectored aid agencies to use the term poor and marginalized in the place of socially excluded, because they felt, the argument came back again and again about what about the high caste poor? Again, a valid argument, but it's a much more complicated issue than that. And then a revived nationalism, a nationalism based on sort of solidarity around the founding of Nepal, the sort of monarchical, what sort of got revived. And the very concept of inclusion became vilified as an agenda that was pushed into Nepal by aid agencies, who were dollar earners, and taken up by progressives, who were, of course, Maoist sympathizers, and by radical communalists, who were, the people leading the civil rights movements, had been tarred by this time as communalists. So at this point, 2011, leading up to, what should have been the promulgation of the Constitution around that time, debate was getting very, very polarized. And very crucially, the media, which is a big, noisy space in Nepal, and sucks up all the oxygen in terms of public discourse, played a very important role in obfuscating the story and sowing confusion about many things, including just what was happening. So what was happening in the Constituent Assembly? It's not that hard to report. There was a massive, what I think as probably one of the most successful techniques, wittingly or both wittingly and unwittingly, was underreporting. So there was just this dearth of information about what was actually happening in the Constituent Assembly and all of the various committees that had been set up to deal with different issues. The other tactic, of course, is misinformation and editorializing, which happens a lot, and scaremongering, distracting. And the other thing that has been hugely destructive, I think, is a huge overemphasis on power in Kathmandu. So almost immediately after the peace process began, the media sort of came in from the hinterlands where they had been reporting to a certain extent on the Maoist war, and then just focused on Kathmandu and power politics in Kathmandu, and it became this obsessive reporting of who said what today and what, and to the extent that we got very, very little reporting from the field and from the rest of the country. And so this complete lack of information that they created about what was happening in the country, I think, created a huge amount of confusion. So I think that, and also, so we saw this play out very sharply when the Constituent Assembly failed in 2012. It was a very dramatic day when nothing was really preventing the media from tagging people around all day and figuring out what was happening. And they didn't do that. And the people who did do that, like Prashant Jha, who based his reports very closely on interviews with people who were in the Constituent Assembly and just coming out to talk to him, were vilified as agents of India, agents of, whatever, the communalists, all of that. Because the story that was, there were two competing stories happened. One was the kinds of stories that Prashant and other reporters who were following the story very closely reported, which is that the Constituent Assembly was basically made to fail because the constitution that was going to come out was going to be inclusive. There had been these cross-party caucuses between Dalits, women, Janjatis, and Madeshis, and it was about to promulgate an inclusive constitution, and that became so threatening to the establishment that basically through an act of no-show by the Speaker of the House, the Constituent Assembly was made to fail. Now this story, of course, was hugely contested by the establishment, including by the media, who chose the side of the establishment very strongly at that point and said that this was not at all what happened, and the country was going to break out into race riots and all kinds of communal tensions afterwards if that constitution had been promulgated. So this, I would say, is the moment when a pattern of cognitive dissonance really asserted itself forcefully in Nepal, and it's a pattern that still exists, where the very facts about what happened are disputed. So nobody actually knows. All we have are opinions or claimed facts from two different political sides about what was happened, and the truth has been lost. I believe that the media has played a hugely destructive role in this, in losing the truth, in letting the truth go, in covering up the truth. So the media, which helped to do this, also helped to normalize the second election for the Constituent Assembly and to champion the more conservative Constituent Assembly that came in with the Nepali Congress and UM majority. And as we know, this assembly also dithered over constitution making until the 2015 earthquake. So this Gorkha earthquake, immediately afterwards, I would say for the first couple of days, there was again one of these rare moments of national consensus, where everyone recognized that this was a disaster this was going to be a disaster of unprecedented proportion, and one for which the state was completely unprepared. And I believe everyone felt we were all going to have to band together and be united to do something about this. But I believe this pattern of cognitive dissonance, which had already been established, set back in within a couple of days, and it's only grown more pronounced since then. So the very factual basis of what happened in the earthquake, I think Kath also made this point, that we really just don't have enough studies, we don't have enough reports, we don't have enough information yet about what happened. So the kind of study that Martin Chaudhary has done, this social audit with Chokat, in a couple of localized areas, seeing what happened and what were the resources available, who mobilized, in what way. I believe we need massive amounts of study just to figure out what is the truth, to just regain the truth from this absence of information that we have. Because I think we'll all relate to the experience we all had, which was completely conflicting stories were coming out about how the army and police were the only ones doing something. No, they weren't doing this. In most places they weren't doing anything, or the government was the only power that could really lead reconstruction and relief. And then it turned out the government was paralyzed itself for such a long time. Funding agencies were, going to make lots of money off the earthquake, or, this funding agency is doing a really good job in this local area. So it was a moment of real confusion. And I don't think we've recovered from that confusion. I think one thing that happened is that in such a polarized situation, it's almost, I think the country has had almost a communal response, which is we trust sources of information we trust. I know that I think the establishment and the establishment media trusts the state and reports things from the state, the mostly straight face, later to question it when it works out not to be true. Those who have always felt historically excluded by the state, been interested in the civil rights movements and in the inclusion movements, don't trust the state and tend to look at it. And there have been small instances of the state performing in certain areas, and certainly we're all going to have to figure out how to help the state work, or how with just cognitive dissonance, people listening to different facts and coming up with happening is continuing till today. So afterwards, when the government stir, not to help the earthquake victims, but to pass a fast-track constitution. Terrible disaster had happened. Now we need to, get on with, earthquake rehabilitation eventually. And so for that we need a constitution, and to demand inclusion and to hold up or delay the promulgation of the constitution was irresponsible. And anyways, the parties had a majority and they could pass it, and it's democratic to pass a vote by majority. So opposing a democratically passed constitution, even though it's not inclusive enough, was seen as anti-democratic at that point, and possibly criminal and possibly even anti-national. So this was the democratic voice that was coming out at the time, immediately in the lead up to the promulgation of the Constitution. And so shrill was this purportedly democratic voice that it almost drowned out the voices of people who were still hoping for an inclusive constitution, but those voices were still speaking. They were speaking softly. The Madhesh movement is probably the loudest of them all, and I believe we would have been following. Okay. So the Madhesh movement is probably the most powerful of all of these, and it has been the voice of inclusion. It's been asking for proportional representation. It's been asking for, proper represent the sort of the proper amount of not sort of the opposite of gerrymandering. Sorry, the word just sort of disappeared. And more quietly, there's been dissatisfaction with the Constitution among other civil rights movements, Janjati and women in particular. I want to play this one poem. This is captures the present moment. I won't play all 5 minutes of it, just the first couple of minutes. This is by Word Warriors. It starts with the Nepali national anthem. And
अग्रगामी राष्ट्र हाम्रो जय जय नेपाल
डलरको रहर बोकेर विदेशी सहर निस्केका मेरा बाबाले आफ्नै घरको बाटो बिर्सिएपछि मैले उनलाई नै बिर्सन थालेँ। स्कुलका फारमहरूमा बुबा भन्ने बक्सा सिधा धड्काले भर्न थाले। त्यही सिधा धड्काको अन्त्यमा मौन प्रश्नहरूको सुरुवात हुन्थ्यो।
तेरो बाउ खै त? तिम्रो बाबा के गर्नुहुन्छ? तेरो बाउले तँलाई यति नै सिकाएन?
मेरी आमा भने मलाई निराश हुन दिन्नथी। मलाई असल स्वाभिमानी देशको सच्चा नागरिक बन्न सिकाउँथे। तर उनले भुलिन्। बाउ स्वीकार्ने बच्चालाई यो देशले नै स्वीकार्दैन। त्यही भुलको भुमरीमा जिल्ला र वडाको सरकारी कार्यालय कोठामा उनलाई मद्दत तिरस्कारको पासो थमाइदियो। त्यो पासो मेरी आमाको घाँटीमा बेरिडायो। 2070 साउन 19 मेरो घरको बन्द कोठामा अँध्यारो छायो। त्यो दिन एउटा छोराले आफ्नी आमा गुमायो।
बाबा सबैले उठेर मलाई स्कुल पुर्याउनुहुन्थ्यो। एक पाउ मासुको तरकारीमा छानी छानी राम्रो पिस मलाई दिनुहुन्थ्यो। आफ्ना हातका औँलाहरू खियाएर धागो र काटीले पैसा बोल्नुहुन्थ्यो। बाबा हर दिन हर रात हर पल मेरै लागि बाँच्नुहुन्थ्यो। तर मेरी बाबाले मलाई छोरी भन्दा सबैले उनलाई प्रश्न गर्थे। तेरो छोरीको बाउ खोइ त भन्थे। किनकि मेरी बाबा एउटी आइमाई हुनुहुन्थ्यो। इन्टु बिन्टु खेल्दादेखि बसेको माया मेरो आमा बुवा जुन बस जात पातका पाठ पढेका गाउँघर समाजले कहिले बुझ्न सकेन। त्यसैले गाउँ नै छोडी सबै नाता तोडी यी दुईले आफ्नै अलग्गै एक सानो संसार बनाए जहाँ एक थपिए म। तर हाम्रो नियतिको गणितमा फेरि एक घट्नु थियो। मैले बुवा भनी बोलाउन नपाउँदै उनलाई अकालै गुमाउनु थियो।
So I'd encourage anyone to watch the full poem afterwards if you can. The Word Warriors, so their chosen medium is spoken word, which is very vernacular and very accessible. And one of the things they do in this piece is talk about, the poem is called Onagarik, Uncitizen. And it expresses, it sort of captures the zeitgeist of the moment leading up to constitution drafting, where there was this obsession in the Nepali establishment with citizenship and retaining the purity of Nepal by not allowing for adulterated citizenship. And of course, the poem is about, it's told from the point of very different points of view, but also from the point of view of a child who's lost both parents and cannot citizenship in the country. And so we're looking now, after the constitution promulgation, not just at a constitution that, ignored the Madesh movement, which the Madesh movement has fought back, as we see, but other movements like the Janjati movements and the women's movement, which are not powerful enough to fight back in quite the same way, to blockade the country, to ask for international help to really bring the establishment to its knees. So we're looking at a moment when the establishment is narrativizing the constitution as democratic enough for now, and it'll get better, which is what we were told all throughout Panchayat and all throughout the 1990s. Whereas these other quieter voices are telling a different story, telling a story of a country where people aren't equal citizens and are being told, women are being told to accept their status as lesser citizens for the sake not just of the nation, but for the sake of democracy in Nepal, because democracy is going to come under threat if we allow women to have equal citizenship and we allow Indians to move in through our wombs and have little half Indian babies. So we're now stuck, and I believe this is exactly where we are right now, is the establishment is stuck telling a nonsensical story of what has happened based on facts it has chosen very partially or concocted. And there's a much quieter voice that has a strong moral voice. The writers, the artists of Nepal, I would say the arts community in general, which has always had this strong progressive voice, is very quiet right now, and it needs to be listened to. It's one of the things that has happened. It's just been drowned out by this establishmentarian media voice. So I want to conclude by just saying that a couple of things I feel are extremely important are, one, listening to local voices in different languages, listening to literary voices, the artists, the people who are speaking with a moral authority on the country, and also just finding out the facts. I think that's one of the really important pieces of work that remain to be done about what exactly has happened with everything. I mean, we won't ever go back, I think, and find out the facts of what happened in the Royal Family Massacre, but we will, I think, we still have a chance to figure out what happened in the earthquake, what happened in constitution drafting, and what is happening right now.
Wonderful. So hopefully we can squeeze in some comments before you go teach.
Sure.
Jennifer. So over to you.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And thank you to Catherine and Manjushri for, I think, really providing, I think, a wonderfully rich context from different perspectives to try to understand this moment, but also this moment as part of a broader kind of history and political context. I wanted to, I'm really only going to offer a few questions that are really sort of coming out of my own, I guess, kind of perspective and way of trying to understand some of these similar questions, but in a different context. And maybe to just give you some brief context, so much of my work has looked at informal and precarious workers and their efforts to organize. And I look at kind of the, and oftentimes people think that this is sort of oxymoronic, sort of how do informal and precarious workers actually organize when they have no leverage, when they have no power, when they're devalued sort of socially. And I think a lot of kind of the empirical perspective I take is that by trying to understand how seemingly powerless groups, whether they're workers or other people in society, try to organize, it's a lens into how we can understand how power operates. Especially, I think, when power is operating in diffuse and decentralized and obfuscated ways. And so in that, I think it's about sort of inverting this idea that precarious work is something that happens to people versus sort of the efforts that workers undertake to try to expose and reorganize power gives us some way to understand how as a resource that people with very little kind of economic or political resources have is kind of this kind of lens. So kind of with that in mind, a lot of the questions that I have for Catherine and Manjushri and to raise for discussion are trying to understand this nexus between political, economic, social, and symbolic power. So my first question really around Catherine is trying to understand on what terms government distribution, albeit paltry and absolutely irrational, when you thought about it from the perspective of, the impact of the earthquake and its consequences to victims and what actually happened. I mean, I think it's pretty stultifying when you showed sort of those various graphs that there is no rational logic, whether you look at deaths or whether you look at the structural damage to housing. But I wonder, were there other sets of social and cultural logics that could be discerned in terms of how the rice was distributed or not distributed to certain regions? And I think you touched on the fact that there was a normalizing logic that sort of certain poor people are used to living in with substandard housing. But I just wondered if there was another set of logics that could help us have any insight into sort of how the state is actually distributing resources, so that we're sort of left without a sense that it's just an irrational government that doesn't know what it's doing, and therefore I think kind of also excuses bureaucrats, because we are all familiar with incompetent bureaucrats, right? But is there a way that we can kind of move past that and hold them more accountable for really gross negligence and gross incompetence? I think the second, the training camp, I think is an absolutely wonderful example of understanding how kind of political forces and social forces on the ground actually may give us insight into kind of capacity, and maybe rather than resilience, thinking about what is the, how do groups in civil society or popular groups actually amass any kind of associational capacity in the context of a state that's constantly trying to disorganize local power, right? I mean, I think that's the absolute context, whether it's linguistically or culturally or in terms of memory. But the fact that different ethno-linguistic and cultural groups came together and really, it sounds like, put forward quite a rational plan as to sort of what kind of representation makes sense, right? And how to actually collaborate in ways that promoted solidarity and promoted collaboration as opposed to exacerbate conflicts. I mean, it seems to me like this is a very rational process. So I'm curious as more in terms of how that came together, right? Was this really just an organic, spontaneous process? Were they representatives of different organizations? Were they, kind of leaders in different informal or customary ways? And so, in other words, kind of on what grounds were these political solidarities forged? And also, how might these grounds give us more understanding of how local groups amass associational power in this in the context of the state's disorganization of power. And then I think kind of shifting from Catherine's talk to Manjushri's talk, I think was really illuminating for me because it tells a very, very different story of what's going on in Nepal. In a way, I think also kind of consistent with your theme of cognitive dissonance. Like, how do we put these together? You know what I mean? Because in one way, I think if these talks weren't together, we would walk away with a very different understanding of what's going on in Nepal. One is absolute, utter kind of reproduction of elite colonial power structures that disenfranchise the majority of the population. And on the other hand, a much kind of, although it's sort of limited, kind of a more robust sense of how even, or how kind of social voices are really aspiring for a political future when kind of the most basic needs are not being met. And so, I mean, one of the questions that I have around this kind of, I guess, kind of social political arena is thinking about inclusion. So, I mean, it's interesting to me that the social and political groups are framing their demands for social and political rights in terms of inclusion. And I'm not sure if there's a kind of translation problem, but I'm wondering, how to think about the relationship between inclusion and recognition. Kind of demands made for kind of for challenging social exclusion have a logic of kind of recognition, right? Whereas inclusion has more of a logic of kind of absorption into the into the polity, and I think absolutely groups demanding for a kind of constitutional reform where they have legal rights in the polity kind of reflect this logic of logic of inclusion. But I'm wondering kind of about this moment that you talked about, where kind of there was this criticism that the word inclusion came from kind of aid groups or external groups, but it captured a political moment, or it captured the kind of aspirational moment. But I wonder, in kind of being the vocabulary that captured that moment, to what extent it actually closed or circumscribed the political potential at that moment. So were there other potential frames that could have been embraced to maybe give a more political space to social struggle? So because clearly when the pushback comes from the state, and the state then, I think, enacts its own conversion narratives around what this means, it could, the kind of the target gets quickly disorganized. And then I think I don't have much time, so maybe I'll kind of leave with this question of how do we rigorously theorize the political potential of the quieter voices, of the aspirational voices that may have been curtailed by kind of the ruling kind of apparatus of the state, but continue to occupy public spaces, continue to put voices out there even after the fact, where it seems potentially futile. One of the things that I've been really thinking about is how there's been decades of research about political agency, but I think we're at a moment where we're not sure how to theorize it or recognize its political potency beyond that. And I wonder, it seems to me like the word warriors and the literary world are giving us very resilient kind of political resources to try to understand this potential, especially in the context of the state's kind of clamping down on this. So, how can we kind of begin to move beyond a romanticized notion of agency and really think systematically about the political potential of the quieter voices?
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you, Jennifer. Normally, I would open this up now to everyone, and you're going to have to run at this moment.
Okay. In like 3 minutes.
That's okay. So what I would do while Jennifer's packing up is just ask you in your kind of gut response to some of the key questions she has for you, and to keep it short, and then we'll come back to all of you, and I'll extend 10 minutes into the break time.
Well, I'm interested in your point about inclusion versus recognition. I think there's been both strains in the civil rights movements, and they're all very different movements with different sort of emotional tenors. The women's rights movement is a lot different, for example, than the other more cultural identity-based ones. So there's been both demands, but the one demand that has been very strong is the demand to be for inclusion into the state. And so around after 2006, when the peace process and this negotiation about how we were going to do this, from then onwards, these movements really focused their efforts on very pragmatic things like proportional representation, like all of the reservations, federalism, and all of these mechanisms. So they really want into the state. They don't want it to be a state where they are outsiders anymore. But this other aspect of recognition, pride, assertion has always gone hand in hand with these movements. So when you look at the Madesh movement, for example, you see the assertion of Madesh pride being very threatening to the establishment, who has always seen Madeshis as not quite legitimate Nepalis because they're on an open border with India. And so there's always been a constant questioning of their Nepaliness. And so the pride aspect always brings up the fear of separatism, which is a constant fear that's evoked with the Madesh movement. But what Bangladesh movement actually wants and how they've articulated their political demands is inclusion. So it's been a really interesting, there's been both strains have been quite strong and have coexisted, I would say.
We'll have to let you, Miss Catherine, too.
Yeah, I can say for a couple
2 minutes.
Let me pick up there. The Janajati movement, with respect to its arguments about federalism, have been very, very articulate and very clear, precisely around the question of both inclusion and recognition. So all of the things that Manjushri has said, absolutely, and so the contestation about boundaries and process and names. And names. I mean, the idea that a place could be named for it. And it's always funny as an American, where more than half of our states are named for indigenous populations, some of whom have no living members, right? And so, but that symbolic recognition is critically important in that. And I would say that this is also one of the ways of thinking about how the group of people who got proposed for this training camp was so representational. First, in the interest of real disclosure, I have to say that in talking with people about running this camp, I said, the one thing I really hope, I said, look, the earthquake hit all of you, all right? And I was very strategic in how I said this, hit all of you. I hope that when you think about who will come and get this training, that you will think about who will bring it back and teach other people, not run off and get higher paying jobs elsewhere, who will, whose ability to learn it and pass it on you will take into account. And I hope you will also make it representative of the populations on the Hill here. And I said, and I just turned around. So I said, I'm speaking to my Tamang and Gurung friends here. Be sure to include a few high caste people, right? Everything else on the Hill is managed exactly the other way around. And I didn't police it. I asked to see the names and it came in. And for purposes of a real shortcut, we'll situate under the idea of intersectionality, the idea that that people are not a single thing, contexts. And Manjushri talked about this. This is obvious. The idea of inclusion, wanting to change that. Change from sama besikaran, the idea of inclusion, to the idea of poor and marginalized. That on the Hill, 12,000 feet, we would call it a mountain, I guess. But the Brahmins, and very few Chetris, it's mostly Brahmins, who are the non-ethnic populations on the Hill, are very poor and marginalized. But they are symbolically included in the armature of the state. And the minute the agents administering or offering or teaching or that come in, the minute that they don't address that immediately, I hate to draw allusions to why is a poor dirt farmer in Kentucky interested in think that Donald Trump has his interests at heart. But the poor and excluded Brahmins in these village areas, it really becomes, where are you asking them to focus their interests? Are you saying, for these purposes, let's talk about our shared poverty and exclusion, or are we going to, by the language we use and by the connections we invoke and by the shared experiences that we have and the traditions that we observe, going to emphasize the inclusion and exclusion, the recognition, the symbolic part of it? And I think you asked also, and I think this is related to that, the irrationality of the government distribution of relief, and were there other state logics? Of course there are other state logics, and those are logics of inclusion and exclusion, of recognition and non-recognition for the most part. But I also would add to that there were logics of the response locally, and it's interesting to look at those to see how suddenly hamlets, which just appears to be like who lives close to whom, right? And the relation of that to kinship, and the relation of that to which tends to be more, not always, but often ethnically or caste distinct, created these islands in which people could, for the moment, set aside this conversation across difference and they really focused on assistance, and so pooled all of the grain that they could salvage from the houses they could salvage from, put it in one big pile and divided it up equally. That's pretty radical. And the way in which then, at least from the local point of view, as they tried to relate to the state, they invoked some of those local logics. So relationships of
So I'm going to stop you.
Yeah.
Because we're getting into the territory of Sarah Schneiderman's paper.
Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer. And
those are wonderful comments, Jennifer.
Yeah, really, truly wonderful. Thank you. That was hard work. I invite anyone here to ask questions of me.
Did you ever look at in your research, I wouldn't be surprised, it was a very impressive presentation, mountainous, localized, closed, stratified, rural, agrarian-based communities, disparate, socially fragmented, destable, pre-disaster, around the world that have suffered earthquakes post-45, and then lessons learned or equivalent database documentation, and compared it with what you personally experienced with the Nepal 2015 earthquake, just as a comparison with the actual effectiveness or non-effectiveness or critical areas of concern for future. Did you ever look, have you looked
Absolutely.
So stop. I'm going to ask you to identify yourself when you're asking a question, and I'm going to take two more before you respond.
And you are?
I'm an historian of Canadian social history, medical history.
Okay.
You have a name?
Galinsky. And welfare state for its 50 years, 20th century Canada. But that to me...
Stop. I'm going because we're out of time. Yeah. So I have two more questions for the table, and I'll start with Ritu and then Rita.
My name is Rita Thapa. I'm from Nepal. I live there. Earthquake survival. In fact, I was just about to go to that bar park area. You know, suddenly something told us we cancelled it. But anyway, you know, I'm very happy to be here. I learned a great deal of things, and I see, you know, I heard. I'm a public health physician, you know, and I believe in the local training, training the local people, you know, and this has produced a lot of. You are from the medical science. Nepal is one of the, you know, few countries who has achieved Millennium Development Goals in maternal mortality reduction, child mortality, because we trained. I was particularly involved in that, training community-based female health volunteers. Having said that, I see the resonance. I learned a lot of things from Manjushri. I like the movement, you know, the voice, you know, Muktan. So bringing, you know, I always look at how I can integrate. I'm a very practical person. Now your local training, you know, Catherine, you said, you know, this is a marvelous thing, you know, training camp. And I presume these are for the local people. And I would like to say, I'd like to know from you the sex composition in this, you know. And bringing that, you know, the Manjushri said, listen to the local voices. So when we design, when we combine, you know, there comes a very big force in these two elements, especially when Nepal is heading, hopefully, they will heading for very soon local election, because this is where the politics also combine. And I like your Catherine's virulent or vibrant politicians. Are they virulent or vibrant? Because this is where, when we combine the local voices with the local skills and training, taking also from them, not only we injecting our knowledge and technology, we also learning from them, because this is what I've learned in public health, which has given all of us a great success. And then the virulent, vibrant politician. That's my question. I want to know the, you know, the practical application of this.
So these are maybe questions that you don't have to answer them. I just want to put them on the table. We could continue them probably with after Sarah's talk as well. I really appreciated this play between the literary imagination, political practice, and then the historical imagination, and the question of the seismic. So my questions, I'm currently working on neoliberal governance and the relationship between liberal and neoliberal governmentality. As you know, I'm in action between the Gurkha conquest, then obviously the Rana kingdoms, and the contemporary is interesting for me because you're, strategically posing a relationship between the ecological and the political. And for me, this is actually formation of contemporary neoliberal politics, the politics of the environment in particular, and indeed the language of environment in business. So I just finished writing a piece that was about the ways in which language, there's now the production of the idea of business environments, particularly in corporate social responsibility and CSR. So I'm interested in that overlap, especially because you focused, Catherine, on local autonomy. And so the idea of the local as opposed to the global is also a neoliberal formation. So the relationship between local autonomy and the idea of folded into authoritarian logics also has a relationship to the principle of revenue rights that we can date back to the Mughal period. So what we see in Nepal is a kind of intensification of the rights in land revenue and jagirdari, zamindari, etc. In the Mughal state of the 17th and 16th centuries, reproduced and fortified, petrified, if you will, by the British colonial state and the caste classification, especially of Gurkhas as warriors, right? So I'm interested also then, as another formation of the neoliberal, the crocheting of the feudal into the contemporary. And this is where I think Manjushri's questions about citizenship and languages of citizenship are so important, because maybe we want to ask, in what ways does the liberal language of citizenship actually enable this crocheting of the feudal? And this question of anagrik is actually a kind of contestation of the ways in which the language of liberal citizenship meets authoritarian governance. Nepal is probably one of the best examples of that. So these are just a set of big questions about the relationship between the liberal, the neoliberal, the idea of the local, the question of environment as the ground for thinking politics, the coding of environment as economy, etc. But we can return to that in the discussion.
Thank you, Ritu. Okay, so I can't answer everything. I want to protect our break. But if you have one comment you'd like to make, and I won't take more questions now, we will resume at 11:30 so that we can finish up with more time for discussion on the whole morning at the end of the next panels. Catherine, Manjushri, do you have a...
Yes, there are other studies. They're not, the best ones are not in fact of earthquake, they're of tsunamis that are out there right now, but they're quite interesting. As for the sex composition in the training camp, it was all male. That was they apologized. We are now running some 6-month-long trainings. The trainings that the government offers the shortest ones were 3 months, which is why I ran a separate one rather than paying for people to go into government one. But we're now funding 50 people, which includes some women, to do more advanced plumbing, electrical, masonry courses that are these longer train things. I think your comments about just how neoliberal are we all really down to our core is a very right thinking one. I invoke the relationship between Barpuk and the earthquake and the history of the Gurkhas. I hope with a little more irony than that. All right. I mean, but I will think about whether I am influenced more deeply. I do think that without arguing too much for Nepal is too special a case, it was not externally colonized, and so whether it's a fossilized pre-Indian colonial state or whether it is what India would have become if it had never been colonized, I think there are a lot of very, very interesting sorts of questions there. And of course, it's also far more than that, because at most India has 8%, 5%, Janajati, tribals in India population.
Well, they don't collect for individual groups.
But total percentage compared to the population. Anyway, way smaller than the percentage in Nepal. And so the contestation and this goes down really deep, to structures of things like gender, like family, like the environment, like power, where there are really competing models at play.
Just wanted to follow up on what Ritu said. So one of the things I find interesting about this poem is there is no liberal logic by which you can respond to this poem and say, no, but Nepal's new constitution is a liberal constitution. The only logic you can respond with is neoliberal logic, which is that to be progressive, as that voice is to be a communist, a Maoist, and so we cannot do that. So there's been this complete conflation of progressive voices with the left in Nepal, which has really forwarded this neoliberal logic. The coherent liberal voice, I would say voices like this are telling a coherent story about Nepal, which is that the story of Nepal even now is one of deep exclusion, even with this new constitution. And so that's I believe that's a liberal logic that's being put forward in this sort of more coherent story.
Huge Professor Sarah Schneiderman, UBC Department of Anthropology and the Institute of Asian Research. Another anthropologist with very long-term ties to Nepal, and another pioneer academic activist, also, as it happens, Catherine March's former student. Academic activist in support of political freedom and more recently earthquake rebuilding rather. And a formidable participant in discussions about the role of critical social science. Many venues, but also on a Facebook group launched after the earthquakes called Earthquake Anthropologists. So Professor Schneiderman is author of the book titled Rituals of Ethnicity, Tangmi Identities Between Nepal and India, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2015.
Yeah, and actually I have some flyers with a discount code for the book in case anybody wants one. Yeah. Okay, I'll put them there.
And her current research includes an ethnography of state restructuring in Nepal since 2006, and an exploration of trans-Himalayan citizenship. We also collaborate on some research on state restructuring and hopefully earthquake response and rebuilding. So her talk is titled Restructuring Kinship, Citizenship, and Territory in the Wake of Nepal's 2015 Earthquakes. James Sharrock, I'm going to introduce you all first, who's moving around here, is a practitioner, researcher, and consultant based in Ithaca, New York, and a critically minded development humanitarian practitioner, I should add, who headed the UK DFID's, Department of International Development field office in Gorkha, which was the epicenter of the first, I think it was, earthquake. He's also interested in humanitarianism as a topic of his research and has worked in Sudan as well as Nepal, and with other agencies beyond DFID, the Carter Center and UNWIN, yeah. So his talk is titled Remote Response, International Humanitarianism and Nepal's 2015 Earthquakes. I'm so pleased that to discuss these contributions we have Professor Ito Pang, who is a colleague in the Department of Sociology and the School of Public Policy at UT, and director of the Center, are you still, of Global Social Policy here. She's currently the principal investigator of a wonderful Great Big Shark project, that's the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, titled Gender, Migration, and the Work of Care, International Comparisons. That kind of looks at how the reorganization of care work influences and is influenced by global migration of care workers. Professor Pang also has sort of deep and important contributions and experience in practice in public policy, having been associated with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development since 1996, and as an advisor for the International Labour Organization. So we're very fortunate to have Peng join us. And let's start now with Sarah.
Thank you.
So I'm keeping to 25 with my reminders.
Okay, I'll do my best. And thanks for having me here. I just want to thank Catherine and everyone here at the Asian Institute and ASHA for making this happen. It's an honor to be in conversation with so many respected colleagues and advisors, and also pretty gratifying to have the opportunity to debrief a bit about some of the really challenging dynamics that I know a lot of us in this room have been engaged in over the past 9 months or so since the earthquakes hit Nepal. And I just want to thank Kath and Manjushri too, who set me up really well, and hopefully that will actually allow me to skip through several slides. So if I'm doing that, don't feel like you're missing out. It's actually because it's material that was pretty much already covered in the first session. So I want to begin my presentation with this screenshot from Hasta Akengmi's Facebook stream, dated January 14th, 2016. Hasta is a member of the Tangmi indigenous ethnic community with whom I've long worked and hails from Alampu, one of the large, historically important Tangmi villages on the ridges running between the northwestern edge of Dolakha district and the eastern edge of Sindhu Palchok district. And this map gives you a little bit of a close-up of where I'm talking about. There's an inset map at the bottom for those of you who want to situate it, but central eastern hills, and the Tangmi community lives across this district boundary. Since last spring, Hasta has worked collaboratively with several informal relief networks to deliver food, corrugated iron, or CGI, sheet building materials, and most recently blankets to his own and adjacent communities. These networks have drawn upon donations from the US and other locales outside Nepal, as well as the logistical know-how and commitment of a Kathmandu-based group that includes both young urban Nepali citizens, long-term resident foreigners, and short-term visitors, such as a group of mountaineers, and also the local knowledge and networks of trust that a charismatic, relatively well-educated man from Dolakha, like Hasta, brings. His post shows a CGI structure, which looks to be in the large category of somewhere in between temporary and permanent homes that now dot hillsides across all of the earthquake-affected districts. And it reads this: made by 4 bandale, or bundles, 32 pieces, Euro 11 pieces, 7 pieces from Siwin, and their own. People of this village will remember for a long time. This statement is addressed to the network of American donors via Facebook. The Euro 11 pieces came through their fundraising efforts. There are several points that I want to draw out from this example. First, the fact that to build a relatively stable, semi-permanent shelter like this, 4 bundles of Gesta, or CGI, are necessary, more or less. In the early days after the quake, the international organizations officially charged with delivering initial relief by the OCHA shelter cluster group in the region, and these included ACTED, Concern Worldwide, Plan International, and Save the Children, just to name some of the largest organizations who were working in the region. All of these organizations were allocating 1 or at most 2 bundles to each household. In some cases, only a limited number of households were designated as worthy of need, and this is a situation that led to community tensions that I'll return to in detail later. And that's what this slide shows. This is actually the current relatively updated Dolakha data dashboard, which is available online through the shelter cluster portal. And it shows you the number of different things, tarps, blankets, CGI bundles that were supposedly delivered. As Kath mentioned, there are some issues with some of these statistics. Just as a starting point, you can see, for instance, that in Suspa Chamawati, which is one of the BDCs I've worked in for a long time, 566 bundles were delivered. That BDC has an official population of just under 1,300 households and an unofficial population, and I'll come back to this later, of over 1,400 households. So 566 CGI bundles were delivered. It gives you a sense of what was done, but also what wasn't done. Therefore, the need for supplements from other sources, such as the loose network that Hasta's post, to whom Hasta's post was addressed, and organizations like Siwin, a well-known mid-sized registered Nepali NGO that has worked in this region of Dolaka on development programs for many years. The second point is that given these uneven experiences of distribution, building each such temporary permanent shelter required procuring that many bundles of corrugated iron, which in turn required strong local, national, and international networks in order to bring goods and services offered by multiple actors through multiple administrative structures into practical articulation with each other. Hasta's post, which we can come back to for a second, leaves unclear where families sourced, quote unquote, their own CGI, which amounted to just under half of the sheets necessary to build this structure, for instance. There are several possibilities, all of which probably applied in different combinations for various households. That families reused their own existing CGI from their destroyed houses, that they used existing cash savings to purchase it on the open market, that they took loans, either from banks at relatively low interest rates or from money lenders at much higher interest rates to purchase it. And finally, that they used the 10,000 rupee payout from the relief fund distributed by the government to each household relatively early on to purchase a bundle, which in fact costs more or less 10,000 rupees on the market. Some received this initial relief payment as early as late May, while most villagers across the affected area had received it by the end of August. And again, I want to point out that this is really different in different areas, and this is something that I think you'll see from hearing my talk in juxtaposition, that there are some real differences. So just because somebody got the payout in one district doesn't mean that everybody else did as well. This last possibility in particular points towards the Nepali state's role in all this. While the government didn't, to my knowledge, distribute CGI sheets directly, it played a crucial role. It was at once enabling and disabling by distributing cash and by maintaining the administrative and regulatory structures within which all of the actors, both formally registered organizations and informal networks, had to work to varying extents in order to successfully disperse materials or cash. Far from being an absent, incompetent actor, as it's often portrayed, I want to argue here instead that the administrative structures of the Nepali state, along with the broader framework of party politics in which they are embedded, actually played a crucial role in determining how other forms of aid, such as that from independent international donors, large-scale INGOs, and nationally registered NGOs were distributed and received. I also want to challenge the notion that, quote-unquote, the state and, quote-unquote, NGOs are two entirely separate. Especially under the Marxist-Leninist-led government that came to power after the new constitution was promulgated, UML has long dominated the NGO sector in Dolaka and perhaps other quake-affected districts in such a manner that the distinction between the state and NGOs that was often drawn in the early days of the quake is no longer accurate, if it ever was at all. Indeed, the Kathmandu Post made clear in an October article that, and I'm quoting here, as most of the parliamentarians are associated with NGOs, they want these agencies to get a sizable chunk of the funds, end quote. And that article went on to describe how, in fact, that was one of the main issues that led to the delay of establishing the National Reconstruction Authority, that all of the parliamentarians were trying to ensure that their own NGOs would, in fact, be the ones to have a piece of the pie. So all of this has prompted me to think often about whether and how the concept of NGO governmentality, which I'm borrowing here from Lamia Karim's work on microcredit in Bangladesh, might apply here. It's helpful, I think, but probably requires further modification to fully describe the deeply entangled assemblage that comprises governance in Nepal, and includes state, organizational, and private actors, particularly and increasingly the hydropower companies in the region in which I'm working. People on the ground must learn to navigate these multiple overlapping regimes. That was the case before the quakes, and it's ever more so now. While recognizing the challenges inherent in this task, I want to suggest that over the last decade since the end of Nepal's civil conflict between Maoist and state forces in 2006, an emergent wellspring of political consciousness and, in fact, experiential expertise in negotiating state structures at the grassroots level has contributed significantly to rural Nepali citizens' ability to make the most of the very difficult situation they found themselves in after the earthquakes. Before going further, I should state clearly here that I'm not suggesting that such citizens possess any inherent or essential resilience, and we've already had a bit of discussion about the problems with that term, resilience, which enabled them to weather the trauma, dislocation, dispossession, and uncertainty that the earthquakes wrought. Instead, through the last decade during which they were engaged with the state in new ways as individual participants in the large-scale processes of state restructuring that ensued after the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Agreement, some citizens from historically marginalized groups learned their way around the administrative machineries in ways that would become crucial to their post-quake prospects for survival. There's no question that the earthquakes in what Kath has already described as the donut-shaped ring of havoc around Kathmandu most severely affected historically marginalized communities, such as the Tamang and Tangmi, along with Dalit groups. And we've heard quite a bit about that already. So let me just be clear then that just as I'm not romanticizing the notion of local resilience, I'm also in no way intending to glorify the Nepali state and suggest that it has acted in an always effective or equitable fashion, which couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, it's the particular shape of the quake's effects which has led, I think, to government's sense of the lack of need to take responsibility. But what I want to do instead is move beyond a kind of caricatured version of or image of earthquake victims as lacking in agency and existing in some sort of non-state space by situating their experiences within the particular historical, political, and social conjuncture at which the earthquake occurred. And this enables us to focus on the effective and political possibilities opened by the earthquakes along the very real disabling and disempowering experiences that it brought. I'll come back to them in a moment. This I'm going to do by sketching out ethnographically based on some of the work I was already doing at the time that the earthquake struck, how some of these domains of territory, citizenship, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm talking about kinship, not religion, but the larger project in which this work was conducted had these themes at its core. And this just gives you some information about this project. And I should say that this has been ongoing since 2014, and I think this is kind of my contribution to the theme of the critical social science panel. Rather than talking about what critical social science might do, my perspective is to show basically how research that was ongoing then could adapt to and respond to the particular situation of the quakes. So in this project, which began in 2014, the large research question that framed the work was, what does it mean to restructure the state, which, as we've heard, Nepal has been engaged in a process of doing since 2006, or indeed, what would it mean to restructure one's own life? And I wanted to make the point with this that restructuring may be at once a top-down administrative process, but also a bottom-up process of articulating new desires for the future, which I believe has been at work in many pockets across Nepal over the last decades, but has taken on a new urgency in the wake of the quakes. And the one other thing to say about the larger project is that it's actually situated in 3 districts, only one of which was directly affected by the earthquakes, but I'll return at the end to give some sense of why I think the discussion is more broadly relevant. I should just say all the pictures here and locally based material is used with explicit consent of the people with whom I've worked for quite some time. I spent the month of March 2015 in Nepal working on the project I've just described, was traveling with my children, and stayed with the family of Mangal and Dalit Hani in Dolaka, as my husband and research partner Mark Turin and I have done since 1998. So just gives you a sense of who we're talking about here. And this was their house. This is what it looked like actually on the day that I left in March. And this was just a couple weeks before the quake hit. When I returned in August 2015, first time since the earthquakes, the first words that Mangal Dai, or older brother, said to me as he hugged me strongly were, Dios, hami bancho. Anyway, we survived in this kind of offhanded way. It was as if we had just picked up a conversation left off in mid-sentence when I had departed before the quake. The epicenter of the second earthquake in May was more or less literally beneath this house in Dolaka district. And since then, there have been over 400 aftershocks, which continue until, as you can see, the most recent one was January 27th, over 4.0. And so But the point I want to make with that is just to say that this was not a singular event from which one begins recovering and rebuilding the next day, but rather the beginning of a long drawn-out period of uncertainty that remains ongoing. In the initial phase, almost all of the buildings were rendered unusable. Now reaching into its 9th month, this crisis has compelled people like Mungo and Dali to reimagine their relationship to the natural and built environment that they thought they knew, as well as to the shape-shifting state and to their own kin multiple times. So just by way of showing what I mean by multiple times, this is what that same house looked like in May after the quakes when my husband Mark visited. Here's what it looked like by the time that I arrived in August. And that point I want to make here is that the remains of the house had been repurposed by that time, not as the family's primary site of residence, but rather as a storage and animal shed. Instead, they were actually living here, which was about 10 minutes further up the hillside in what used to be one of their millet or cornfields in, again, these CGI structures that you've seen already. And that's where I stayed in August. So I'm just going to talk briefly through some of the context surrounding these transformations and consider how they relate to some of the ongoing work that I was already doing about how Nepali citizens conceptualize the territory in which they live, to begin to suggest what some of the long-term implications might be on natural, social, and political dynamics. So here's the section that we skipped through because you've heard these details and I don't have time for it. I'll land there just to say that as Manjushri told us, there's been a very virulent politics of territory in Nepal over the last decade, which has heightened over the last couple of years as these federal boundaries have actually been demarcated. This is the map that ended up going with the 2015 Constitution. I can't draw out all the implications of it. Suffice it to say that the territorial boundaries were not what any of the marginalized groups had agitated for and had been led to believe some credibility would be given to. So I put that out there just to show why I think it's important to understand how practices of territoriality are constituted at the grassroots level. It has seemed to me throughout this period that territory itself is taken for granted, as if there's a shared and easily understood notion of what it is and what it means to people. And what I had been trying to do with my research already, Fake Struck, was to add some nuance to that and try to understand how local people themselves were imagining ideas of territory. And this is why the question became so crucial also after the earthquake. This is a landscape that's rich with culturally specific meaning and lived knowledge embedded within the landscape that's indicated, for instance, through the many temples to territorial deities, and you see one of those in the center of this shot, just under the trees there. At the same time, it's carved up by state-mandated administrative boundaries, with the smallest units called village development committees, or VDCs, which Kath already introduced. So I've been trying through this larger research to understand the relationship between these two visions. Now, Kath suggested already that VDCs seem to be developed in an almost random manner that didn't necessarily recognize kin groups or naturally occurring boundaries, which is very true. This administrative unit was introduced in the 60s as part of Nepal's last great phase of territorial restructuring, which also created the current 75 districts, and it is a geographically and demographically flexible designation. It can describe anything from a typical village, quote unquote, with houses and community life clustered around a shared physical or cultural center, to a disparate smattering of houses across the hillside with little social cohesion. Oh, and just to give you a better sense of it, this is the VDC map, again, of Dolaka. This is from an early OCHA report. So there's two ideas here, which I'm talking about. One is the notion of the village, or the gaon, which I think about as the effective way that villagers themselves constitute ideas of territory and belonging. And the other one is the administrative notion of the Gaon Vikas Samiti, or Gabisa, the Village Development Committee. And this is something that came out very much from the early phases of this research that I was doing, that people had a very strong sense of both of these forms of territory, but they were differently bounded and came into different articulation with each other at different times. So I would say that in contemporary Nepali discourse, the term Gabisa signifies the administrative aspect of what we might term the village with a capital V, the framework through which citizenship and land documents are issued, as well as central government funds distributed, while the gaon continues to signify the village with a lowercase v, or what I would call the village as a set of social relations. In our research interviews, when asked where the territorial boundaries of their gaon, or village with a lowercase v, are, most respondents answered in concrete terms that allude to specific geographical features, such as rivers and hills, but also patterns of human settlement, and they provide similarly descriptive responses when asked where the boundaries of their gabisa are. And the point I want to make here is that people know where it is. It's not as if it's a kind of abstract thing, although it might have originally come from a centralized state planning initiative. By now, those boundaries have become internalized and they are meaningful to people within their lived environment. So let me now talk a bit about what that means for responses to the quake. In the initial days after, there was a scramble for data and access. Location in its geographical sense was the necessary starting point for relief, but also in the socio-political sense, one of the obstacles to achieving it. From international humanitarian organizations to small-scale citizen action groups, one of the big issues for everyone in the first stage was knowing where to go. And the problem was that many of the organizations had little understanding of this territorial and administrative reality that I have just described. So while on the one sense, villagers themselves might also be confused by this, so were those who were tasked with responding, which varied largely across different organizations, but there was the understanding. This is an early image from to make is that there's 2/3 of the page is showing how things get to Kathmandu porters and helicopters, as if logistics stopped there. And I think anybody who has been involved in Nepal knows that the logistics in simply getting there could also take up a whole page of their own. And of course, there have been attempts to figure that as well. I don't want to set up a straw man here, but the point that I do want to make is that varying ways of conceptualizing rural areas as kind of remote or somehow also similar, in the same way that Stacey Pigg has talked about in terms of the development project, long-standing development projects as a whole. This, I think, caused many of us who have worked on the ground in many of these communities to get it precisely because of the sort of not just local knowledge, but ability to communicate very specific things. Kath and I had a conversation, for instance, about longitude and latitude coordinates in order to get helicopter dispatchers in Kathmandu, and that's the kind of level at which information was actually being requested from us as well through different kinds of networks. So what happened after the quake? Well, in the interim between the two big quakes, and here I'm talking about, again, the area of Dolaka where I've long worked, initial supplies had arrived. The first were actually from an Indian Hindu religious organization, interesting point there. Then from Nepali Congress political leader Gagan Thapa, who you see up in the upper left-hand corner. Then soon thereafter by former Maoist Prime Minister Baburam Bhattarai, who came and made a speech also in another Dolaka VDC. And all this to make the point that from the very beginning, although the state is perceived as having been doing little, these actors were there and they were actually making this a state issue and a political issue in their engagements with local communities. The next people to arrive were an ad hoc citizen action group which delivered food supplies, it seems, to most of the 1,300 households in the VDA. And then next, and finally, Plan International, which was the organization tasked with distributing supplies in the particular VDC of Suspachumwati, where I've long been based. These were buried in the second quake, and people worked through the night to save them from the rubble before rain came. And let's see, in the intervening months, many other organizations came into the area. These are from my August trip, during which I made a list of every piece of branded material that I saw, and I came up with 14 organizations, and this was, again, within one VDC. And I'm counting here also the Chinese government, which is responsible for the Blue Tent, the Salvation Army, and then Habitat for Humanity. So in all of this, it was the Gabisa, so that administrative unit, that really came to matter, as it was on the basis of these existing political boundaries that relief was distributed and relief territory was divvied up. So I want to argue that the earthquake has in fact heightened people's sense of ownership over a particular territory in this administrative sense, just as they've sought to make use of the natural resources that their village, in the affective sense of Gaon, understood as being at the intersection of specific terrain, embodied knowledge of it, and a network of in-place social relations has afforded. So people have rapidly adapted to the new situation by mobilizing resources within both frameworks. For instance, when they realized that the Gabisa was the operative unit for the distribution of relief, people petitioned the Gabisa secretary for better servicing by international organizations, and in this case received results. And I should say, this is perhaps relatively unusual in that this Gabisa is one of the few that had a very active and apparently committed secretary soon after the quake. So as I mentioned, it was perceived that the distribution of CGI sheets by Plan International had been inequitable because it did not actually universally cover all families. And so a petition was launched. This is within one ward, a smaller administrative subdivision, ward number 5, saying 76 households have not received CGI sheets from any organization, and we are requesting additional support. This was then forwarded to the VDC, and the VDC wrote an official letter, which you see here, which was then couriered to Plan, and my understanding is that situation was then resolved on the basis of the VDC secretary's intervention. Use this as an example of where administrative structures were perceived not only to work, but to be accessible to and negotiable by local actors who are often perceived as being marginalized or unable to participate politically. This is an Gaon level, which mobilizes kinship relations to access natural resources. As I was walking down the road, this guy was chopping down the tree. And I said, "What are you doing? It's blocking the road." And he said, "I know, but I need a tree to rebuild my house." And I said, "But isn't the use of timber being regulated by the Ban Samiti, or the forestry user group, which is very active in this area?" And he said, "Of course, I'm on its board." So, that was a kind of interesting interaction, which I then talked about with other people as well. And there have since been a very long and drawn out set of meetings. I just heard that the last one was last rules for the harvesting of timber as everybody tries to start rebuilding their house at the same time. So one of the questions then in all this becomes, what will happen after administrative boundaries are actually restructured in the wake of the new constitution? I need a few more minutes. And will villagers who before the earthquake, who supported restructuring along ethnic lines, turn against this idea as they seek to maintain existing administrative boundaries that they've now learned to mobilize within effectively? And this might be a somewhat contentious point, but the pre-earthquake interviews that I was doing in this larger research project suggested this tension. In these interviews, the engagement with which people described their territories, along with the boundaries that defined them, was remarkable, especially when in many cases they then claimed ignorance about political debates over territorial restructuring. When asked whether they thought boundaries should change, those who were familiar with federalism debates and in favor of it often stated just as strongly as those who were not that administrative boundaries should not change. They made strong statements about their effective comfort level with their own abilities to work within this system, which many perceived as having been hard won, mostly over the last decade. And even when they had a political desire for administrative change, so people who were very much in favor of the idea of federalism and restructuring theoretically, often seem not to have considered the possible impact of administrative boundary shifts on effective dimensions of territorial consciousness and what this would mean for them before being asked these questions. So I just want to speak briefly about citizenship and kinship too. That's sort of the territory section, and the other two are much briefer. As mentioned earlier, the Nepali government made an initial payout of 2,000 rupees to each earthquake-affected adult in the initial weeks. It was only much later in August that the next installments began to be distributed, and then only after households had applied for an earthquake-affected identity card. These were issued by the District Disaster Relief Committee at the District Administrative Office letter. And applying for one required a recommendation letter from none other than the VDC Secretary once again, as well as an existing and undamaged Nepali citizenship card, or Nagrikta, and this was how applied. And the main point that I want to make here is that earthquake affected as a category has become yet another category of differentiated citizenship. And people have begun referring terms of identification cards, already. The traditional Nagrikta or national citizenship card. On the bottom you see an Adivasi Janajati ID card. Bit different because that's one that belongs to a child, so not actually adult citizenship in the same way. There's a hydropower affected person ID card. There's also a voter registration card, and then I just put it in the middle, an Indian voter registration card, which, by the way, a lot of people in this area also have because they are migrant laborers to India and maintain kind of multiple citizenship, which is something I've written about elsewhere. So the main point to make here is that actually in this preliminary research, one of the things that especially a lot of women spoke about was an opening up of citizenship to them and the way in which after 2006, they were actually able to participate in processes, say, applying for citizenship for a child in a new way which hadn't been possible before. And there were several explicit examples of this. We all know now that that's been curtailed again with the 2015 Constitution. But the point that I want to make is that what happened between 2006 and 2015 is still very real for people at the kind of effective level of political consciousness, and that has significantly impacted the way that a lot of people, particularly women, have thought about their ability to engage with the various administrative forces necessary to gain support after the earthquake. Here you see one woman in the foreground, Bimala, who's been especially involved in community organizations on this. Now, I know I'm out of time. So just the last point I want to make is about kinship and the restructuring of households from joint extended households to nuclear residential households. There has been a strong push in this direction for two reasons. One is due to the lack of buildable land, which is making it difficult for people to construct large shelters, and also the sort of limitations of the CGI construction. And so this is one example of Mangal and Dali, who I showed you at the beginning, where their son is living in one of these with his wife and two children, and they are living in the other one. The other issue, however, is of course the way relief has been distributed, because going back to this, the card is not for an individual, it's for a household. And so that takes us back to the old politics of what constitutes the household, which has been a long-standing debate within development studies, right? But it's here all over again, and the locally made distinction, and let's see, did I get this? Yeah, to put this up here, is Duri versus Chulo, right? With God Duri being actually the formally recognized household, and Chulo, hearth or chimney, being used as the term for the subsidiary off. And this is a survey that was done by this local community organization in the early days after the quake, and they showed this on the left-hand side. So you see HH's households, 99, but and by that they were saying that the officially recognized number of households by the census in this area, in this ward, was 99. However, there were 116 actually separately functioning households because a family had already split off. But unable to get that recognized for the government and then government-supported international and national organizations to designate relief for those households, people had to go through an incredibly complicated process by which I was told they had to have how many witnesses? I think 7 witnesses in order at the village level in order to be recognized as a legitimate household. And so this, of course, had many implications for what people ended up doing. And people were often saying to me that when relief is forthcoming, we, of course, split into several households, but when we have to pay taxes, again, we unite, becoming a single household. So there is definitely a sense of a kind of a strategic manipulation here of these categories, and that's the point that I really want to close on, though, that for instance, joint to nuclear families might actually become reshaped. I mean, and those preferences might be determined in the long term by the way that relief distribution works. But at the same time, we might see this actually as a kind of agentive way that people who are often seen as the subjects of humanitarian aid are actually themselves becoming the architects of aid and the categories by which aid must be distributed, and in that way taking a kind of agentive role in the overall process, and that's something that we saw with the BBC example as well. So I will stop there and say thank you very much.
perfect example of critical social science informing.
Again, thank you to Catherine and all the organisers. It's a real privilege to be invited here, and it's been a great panel, and I've really enjoyed it so far. I think you'll see from my PowerPoint, my presentation, that I've not been to the Cornell School of PowerPoint Training. I've not taken Cath March 101 PowerPoint training. But well, there might be some sort of interesting slides anyway.
Jeff Childs, he's the top on that one.
So first of all, I just want to begin with a kind of story or a kind of anecdote about how I got thinking about what I call remote response. So as was mentioned, I was working as a head of a field office for the UK government's Department for International Development, or DFID. And one day I was going to see colleagues in the, I was working in Gorkha, and I went up to Gorkha Bazaar. And I went to visit colleagues in the, who were working for the International Organization of Migration, IOM. IOM was one of the leading responders, and I went to talk to them about going to visit displaced people who've been displaced from their homes. And I was expecting a discussion about a field trip, basically. I was expecting a discussion about going out with them to talk to them and visiting the displaced people. And what I ended up going into, and what I didn't realise was going to happen, was I was introduced to a group of people who were visiting from Kathmandu, who were what they called the Displacement Tracking Matrix Team. And they were sitting on their laptops, and they were on Google Earth, and they were using the history function on Google Earth. I don't know if people are familiar with that. And they were looking at IDP, basically at displaced people's camps, using that function. And I began to think, things are changing. I'd seen things changing elsewhere, but I began to think that, to sort of think about the ways in which aid was changing and the ways in which that impacted our response. So just to give a sample of what this looked like, this was the actual site they showed me. This is just north of Darling-Bessie. And this was what it was like in 2014, before the earthquake. This was what it was like, I think that's in June. The dates are kind of a bit mixed up. And you can see, you can actually count the number of sort of essentially households there. You can see some details there. And Google itself actually did kind of more coverage of Nepal. I don't exactly know how that worked, but the satellite went over, covered Nepal much more widely than it normally does, which is about once a year. And so within May and June, if you look on the Google history function of the earthquake affected areas, if you download Google Earth, then you can see these sites. You can spot these sites quite easily if you sort of know where they were. And you can go through, and this is sort of kind of this is kind of the by timeline. So at the top 2 rows, you can see 1 or 2 tents have come in early May, and then there's cloud cover. This also happens. It blocks their view. It's not a complete picture. And then more people are coming, and then more and more, and then the last slide that we were talking about. And this was used quite widely by this team, and it was quite interesting to me, in kind of positive and negative ways, and just thinking about how aid was changing. They weren't just doing it for sites that were sort of relatively easy to get to. They were also using it for more remote areas, and it made me think about some of these issues, which I'm going to talk about now. So basically, talk is a kind of untidy mix. I'm presenting a partial analysis of the failures of the earthquake response in Nepal. So basically, my central thesis and argument is that the problems in the aid response worked. I'm not downplaying the role of the Nepal government or politicians. I'm only suggesting that our frame of analysis extended. So as talk comes from my working in the earthquake for DFID for about months, but it also 4 years of work in Nepal in different locations and with different organisations. And also I'm using a sort of some ideas and things that I picked up when I was working in the Sudan for about 4 years in conflict zones with UN peacekeeping. And it should be fairly obvious, despite all of that, that what I say are my own views. And basically, the international, what I mean by the international humanitarian response is basically UN agencies, the main UN agencies who are involved. So the United Nations Development Programme, the UNICEF, the World Food Programme, IOM, international NGOs, and basically looking at what they did after, in sort of 4 or 5 months after the earthquake happened. I'm not really focusing on reconstruction at all. I'm basically looking at the internationalists because that's what I'm familiar with most in terms of the response. I think they also deserve our attention because of the sheer scale of their operations, even allowing for sometimes for creative ways of measuring that aid, and their own creative ways, or double accounting. And so that when they worked alongside the government, the two responses are kind of interlinked. It's difficult to separate them. I want to make it clear that I'm not anti-technology. I'm using a laptop, and I'm not against the other ways, which I'll briefly discuss, that technology was used in the earthquake response. As I'll say later on, I think a lot depends on your connection and the types of connection that people have between the online and the offline world. And I think that explains a lot of sort of things that went on. So first of all, the first section I'm going to look at is trends in what I call trends in humanitarianism, which I think help shape this, some of the ways in which humanitarianism is changing. And they're interlinked trends, and I think they played an important role in Nepal. Part of my argument is that the ways in which humanitarian organisations do their jobs is changing. There's always been a level of kind of detachment in humanitarian workers. There's always been a kind of remoteness. There's already a remoteness. Aid workers are typically ignorant of the languages and cultures of the area in which they work in, and they've been hired primarily on the basis of their thematic or technical expertise, gender, protection, water, sanitation. That is all still true, but I think there are important ways in which this is also changing to a deeper remove, and it should force us to update our own critiques of humanitarianism. So the first thing is on what I call remote response. I'm drawing a lot on the ideas of Mark Duffield, who's been working on this lately, and what he calls remote methodologies. He's primarily talking about area studies, but he also talks about the aid world. And so it's basically a greater use of satellite phones, mobile phones, big data, online mapping tools, and geospatial imagery. It has parallels in the kinds of development you see in some forms of field research that people are doing, and also in things like drone warfare. These technologies offer more and different kinds of information, often in real time. It's a kind of paradigm break. Still require, like I said, thematical or technical expertise in one particular area or several. But increasingly important are skills in handling big data, managing social media accounts, producing some of the slides that were in Sarah's presentation, running collaborative mapping projects, and things like that. The reasons behind this, I think, include a kind of stretched humanitarian system with a number of emergencies around the world, a so-called shrinking humanitarian space, whereby access and security shrink the area of operations, and also basically a shortage of funds. A second trend that I think is important is that the ways in which conflict responses have recently shaped humanitarianism in several important ways, and how that differs from disaster responses. I think this is a really important way of thinking about what happened in Nepal. So experiences in places like Syria, Afghanistan, and the Sudans generally led to increasing bunkerization and security concerns. In many of these countries, humanitarians have been targeted and they rarely venture to the field. There are typically access problems in reaching civilian populations. Not only does this encourage this kind of remote responses and digital workarounds, it also shapes fundraising and coordination in very specific ways. So basically, typically conflicts are harder to raise money for, but the very lack of funds encourages a kind of greater coordination among humanitarian actors. In contrast, disasters, and I'll talk about this a bit later in the context of Nepal, they're easier to raise money for, but this also reduces the incentives to coordinate. And the extra money in disasters also changes the definition of who is a donor. So it typically benefits humanitarian agencies and NGOs, international NGOs, so IOM, WFP, Save the Children, Oxfam, but less so traditional bilateral development donors who are somewhat left out of these crises. So people like DFID or USAID, who have typically kind of fixed sort of funding. The third trend that I'm going to mention here is what I call, and has been called, cash and voucher humanitarianism. So essentially, this is on the rise. It's a big trend in humanitarian thinking to try to push out as much money as possible in cash transfers. Essentially, in a humanitarian situation, with this cash and voucher humanitarianism, the aim is to replace in-kind goods with cash transfers that recipients, who are, know their best their own situation, can use in the way that they see fit. It basically comes out of sort of development thinking and social welfare practices in Southern Africa. There's a great new book or relatively new book by James Ferguson on this issue. It's also been used in refugee populations in places like Turkey. And like I said, it's been in a recent panel by the Overseas Development Institute in the UK, basically on humanitarian cash transfers. Didn't dispute the need for cash transfers, basically just said there should be more and more of it. How can we put more and more of this into development and humanitarian funding? So that gives the sort of overview of what I think is the first kind of thing, I want to discuss basically how it interlinked with the second part, which is the Nepal government and humanitarianism. So basically my focus is not on the Nepal government's response, and we've heard a lot about that already today. But I don't also just want to present, there's an international side. They work together. International intervention didn't occur in a vacuum. And in important ways it gave some legitimacy, and also combined with the government's approach towards the earthquake. I think one thing, first of all, thinking about on here, historical examples. A lot of people have talked about Brahma Shamsher's book on the 1934 earthquake. I think that's some interest. There's been an article that's written on that's quite interesting. But I think we also need to remind ourselves of more recent parallels in the government responses, and specifically three different ones which came to mind when I was thinking about this issue. First of all, the ways in which the authorities responded to people displaced from their homes in 2008 in the Koshi barrage floods, or basically how they didn't respond. The very slow response to places in eastern Nepal after the 2011 Sikkim earthquake has direct parallels with what's been going on. And also the state's poor handling of fundraising and relief after the 2014 Everest avalanche. Obviously the victims were a lot less in that case, but the parallels with particularly the Everest avalanche example are very interesting. And then thinking about the second part, the humanitarian approaches of the government, I think for me, sort of on the ground and thinking about this issue also, the government's response to the earthquake also resembled basically they had kind of adopted the idea in some ways that this was a large development project. This wasn't any different from doing a development. This included how needs were interpreted, basically from a long-term development point of view. It included the usual sort of bureaucratic obstacles that we've been talking about, rent-seeking opportunity, centralization at nearly every stage. And it also, many government officials and NGO workers also assumed that they knew how to run a humanitarian emergency because of this development expertise. That the two were the same. And more specifically, on a sort of practical scale, when thinking about things like cash transfers, the government also conceived of humanitarian relief. They saw humanitarian relief basically as compensation for loss. loss of property or loss of life, and they viewed it in that way, not as a need deriving from the obligations of a state in emergencies, and not as something that derived from needs in the first place. It came from what had disappeared. So now I'm going to talk, and I don't know how I'm doing for time, but think about the analysis of the response, basically how these two things came together, how the humanitarian trends and things that I was describing and how the government sort of worked together, and what kind of particular responses and particular kind of failures came out of that. First of all, like I was saying, the definition of a donor changed. In the UK, for example, the Disasters Emergency Committee appeal, the main appeal for the Nepal earthquake, raised $121 million US, and apparently 25% of UK households gave money to that appeal. While, for example, a similar appeal for Syria raised a lot of money, but it was only 38 million US dollars. The result in this kind of situations is that basically many international NGOs in the UK context don't need to listen to DFID. The end result is that somebody like Save the Children has nearly as much money as DFID, and it doesn't become dependent as it would maybe in a conflict or a normal development situation. And interestingly, and this is not really part of my analysis, but even a volunteer group, sort of informally known as Yellow House, formerly known as, I think, the Himalayan Disaster Relief Volunteer Group, they also became a donor. They called for proposals, which is really interesting. Secondly, and this is a bit kind of inside baseball, so I won't go too much into it, but on the needs targeting and needs assessments and targeting side, the remote response and the government approach, how it came together, affected also how needs were assessed, and therefore what, if any, subsequent targeting of aid was possible to the most vulnerable. Essentially, if there's no need hierarchy in a disaster situation, if there's no need hierarchy established when you assess needs, then no targeting is possible, and nearly everybody becomes vulnerable, and emergency needs are not met. And again, it's almost as though a development project is taking place. And the original sin, in my view, in the Nepal case, the original sin was in the poor initial assessments. They were done by the government primarily, but also supported by internationals, based on basically little or no field work. And they took a simplistic view of needs, almost again from a development point of view, and were also rushed in order to compile data for the post-disaster needs assessment and a pledging conference that took place in June. Because of this, basically manipulating aid and promoting the idea of blanket distribution became relatively straightforward, and there were no checks, kind of put in place. And as we've seen, areas that receive lots of things and areas that receive nothing. In the Gorkha district, the VDCs, the villages of senior political leaders, were often assessed as having 100% damage to all their properties, while other less accessible areas were not even assessed properly. And internationals didn't question the biases inherent in this data until it was basically too late. Subsequently, there's been a lot of attempts to try and get better pictures on either a district, sub-district, or cluster-based, sort of a cluster level, by internationals trying to sort of reclaim control over the data and get a more complex picture of needs, which kind of illustrates the continuing importance of, terrible word, ground truthing. And then thinking about like the relief distribution, I'll just skip some areas. Basically, the lack of a detailed assessment, and also the government approach that was adopted allowed relief basically to become dominated by two things, and it doesn't have to be this way. Is sort of also the part of my argument. It was dominated by the CGI shooting and the cash distribution. So this reflected both the trend of cash humanitarianism and the government's idea of aid as compensation for loss. The two items limited what is known as the kind of the humanitarian bandwidth. They limited this already kind of limited capacity, as well as the ability of the system to provide more nuanced responses to the needs questions. So it was only about cash, it was only about CGI, and it remained in that case in some districts for months afterwards. The cash distribution obviously did help some people, but it was uneven based on this flawed data. And as has been mentioned, the anticipation of receiving this relief led people to take out loans, often at high interest, many of which have still not been paid back. And the situation was further complicated by attempts belatedly to try and get more targeting in there, and kind of ad hoc top-ups that were done by several NGOs. And the government continues to use cash relief as the primary mode of delivery in response to political pressures, most recently in the kind of money that was sent for winter clothing. For citizens, I'll run over some of this. Basically, in brief, for the citizens, kind of already been covered. I want to say volunteer or DIY humanitarian movements, in many ways they're directly linked to the sluggishness of the government and international aid response, as well as the demand for a more complex approach to needs. They also use the remote online tools that I'm talking about, but like I said at the start, they had a stronger connection between the online and offline worlds. So it's a different kind of thing. There was still some problems with that, but it was a different kind of connection that they were able to use. I want to mention here that in the kind of the last sort of thing that way it was used, there were many ways that organisations themselves incorporated digital humanitarianism. Nepal again was a kind of laboratory and the first opportunity for humanitarians to try out many tools developed in conflict context. UNDP developed with Microsoft a mobile phone application to capture details of household debris, which was then extended into a generalised record-keeping tool. And here is a great quote, and I couldn't believe it when I found this out, about what the most senior UN official in Nepal said about this. He said, basically, about this mobile phone app, we can track what we're giving people and where they are. With all of that information already in the cloud, we have a helicopter view on what is happening and whether people in need of aid were reached and supported. It's so huge. We can revolutionise the entire global response to disasters. With a cell phone, we can change the world.
They say about banking as well.
And
It's both true and scary.
The kind of tools that come out of so these kind of tools basically come out of more insecure environments in Nepal, reflected what I'm calling this withdrawal from the field, as well as new kinds of humanitarian data. It wasn't just UNDP. IOM were using, like I said, this displacement tracking matrix. Open mapping tools were used by other UN agencies. Private cell phone data were used to track population movements, were used by NGOs. Interestingly, this also changed the humanitarian worker. If you went to the hotels in Kathmandu, there's a new kind of humanitarian aid worker there, new kind of IT expert. Humanitarian private businesses came to look for business from the Nepal government. Many of them unsuccessful, but it brought in a kind of different kind of humanitarian aid worker. Now, thinking about the practical and critical conclusions, basically I've tried to suggest ways of delivering aid can become complicit in old problems. I've tried to illustrate how remote responses, cash humanitarianism, and the problems humanitarians have in responding to disasters led to response failures. Practically, the system needs to learn how to work more effectively in disasters and how to link up with more humane and less remote ways of working. Specifically, I think there's a continuing need to test data in the field, to think hard about the use of cash transfers, and to think how best to target aid resources as opposed to carrying out blanket distributions. Thinking critically conclusions, I think there is a need to update our own critique of humanitarians and use our leverage as taxpayers and donors to put pressure on our governments and aid organisations. Ironically, that involves a lot of the use of this new digital humanitarianism, a lot of the data that's now online. We can learn also, I think, from the critiques and the ways in which humanitarian organisations were held to account during the conflict and peace process in Nepal, in both good and bad ways. And I want to end basically by saying, just ending on this point, that the great urge to do something practical, I am also a practitioner, so I'm part of that. The great urge to do something practical should continue, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of kind of critical engagement as part of doing something. I think it's also part of doing something and showing solidarity with Nepalis. Thank you very much.
Panel and workshop. workshop, and I'm glad I came and sat from the beginning, because the previous panel gave me sort of much better understanding, together, sort of much better understanding of the context and situation in regards to Nepal's earthquake and Nepalese politics. So both Sarah and James' presentation for this panel really looks at sort of disaster such as Nepal's 2015 earthquakes as a kind of critical juncture or opportunity for really radical rethinking of sort of the way we do things and practice, and also sort of as a moment to think about radical social and political reorganization. I think also disasters like this is sort of a really important moment for intense learning, not just about the disaster risk management, but also about sort of people and institutions. I'm saying this because I knew almost zero, nothing about Nepal or disaster issues. My work, my background sort of is in comparative social policy, and particularly focusing on East Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, in comparison with Europe. So I'm not familiar with the sort of issues and research on earthquake disasters, but I do look at economic crisis, which I think is probably another form of disaster, and how people and institutions and governments respond to that. So in a way, physical disasters like earthquakes and tsunami also, I think there's a kind of resonance with the economic crisis as well. So in sort of listening to the presentations, I was thinking about sort of, I was reflecting on some of the things that I had sort of learned over the last few years in relation to Japan's earthquake and tsunami in 2011, because what the discussion today sort of has some resonance to some of the learnings that people in post-Tohoku tsunami and earthquake were also kind of thinking about. And in my mind, I was thinking in so many ways there is a kind of universal parallel in this moment, in that we could be learning and sharing, and yet often it happens at the different sort of parts of the discipline and different parts of the world. So things such as and I think this conversation also tells us very clearly is that kind of outpouring of the global humanitarian response, but the inadequacies of the government responses, the lack of coordination, and the sort of that real long-term sort of suffering and costs of both visible and invisible human suffering. And I think one thing that I know people who were discussing about Tohoku tsunami and earthquake also talked a lot, and this panel really reiterated and reinforced was the importance of sort of engaging people at the local level, especially vulnerable people, in sort of understanding how to deal with this. It's not sort of, it's the issues, the disaster response is not a sort of top-down activity, but the bottom up. So in my mind, as I was listening, I was thinking about 4 things, and then that kind of then connects me to a bunch more questions than sort of thoughts. But so I was 4 words kind of kept coming to my mind. One is moment, sort of moment in a sense of using disasters such as this as an opportunity or opening for political change, for structural reorganization, for the kind of that transformation. The second is the second word was learning. Sort of this also sort of gives us opportunity for discovery and rediscovery of kind of self and relationships and learning about larger structures. Third words that came to my mind was kind of experience, that the kind of both the universality and the uniqueness of this experience, and how can we mobilize this experience into more concrete for change, more organization, whether it is through the narratives, through reshaping narratives, or through political action, or through individual agency to navigate very difficult terrain, political and physical. And then finally, I was thinking about the words such as movement. So it's sort of associated with this was things such as how to use this to move forward and to reconfigure and reshape politics and organizations. And so that then brings me to sort of a number of questions. So I can just kind of list them out very sort of quickly. So Sarah's question, Sarah's presentation. So Sarah talked about sort of how people are mobilizing to navigate both sort of effective and political opportunities to basically to sort of claim and gather resources at the ground level. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about how these sort of individual mobilization and navigation sort of does it translate to further social and political consciousness or movement? Could you see where this could go in future and further on? So also, because this is a moment of opening for, you also talked about multiple citizenships, particularly women's citizenship. I understand that from I hear correctly, that moment closed as well. But what does that opening of multiple citizenship means in terms of the longer term citizenship rights and practice? In other words, it's one thing to have ID cards, lots of ID cards, but how do you translate that to your everyday, practical rights and things like that? In terms of James' presentation, I'm glad you gave the sort of at the end practical solutions. I thought that was really great, because one of the questions was like, you had a very kind of tentative and ironic sort of take on the limits of technological solution, and I totally agree. I also wanted to ask, like, how do you then effectively incorporate the disaster response? I also want, so is this sort of from your presentation, I also want to know whether you think whether we need to how do we separate and how do we sort of deal with them? Another question is there a role for traditional bilateral organizations like UN agencies to actually to coordinate, sort of humanitarian responses better? So you talk about all these NGOs, that have just as much resource as the bilateral organization. Is this sort of I could see good and bad in it, but is there a way to coordinate these activities? And I think you gave a sense of that in terms of, we need to lobby our own government. The donor government needs to begin to sort of take action. It's not just a question of, international organization or the receiving country issue, but it's a donor country policies as well. Another question that comes to my mind is sort of, I mentioned this, humanitarianism's, particularly disaster responses, so it's often thought in terms of short and medium term issue, but how do we think and how could we plan in terms of longer term sort of response? So, for example, if we were to respond to Nepali earthquake, not just this year, 5 years, 5 years into, 10 years into, how would that look like, and what would be your sort of suggestion to that? So, thank you. Yeah.
Deep thanks, Ito, and also for beginning to orient us, and James, you're at the end of your talk, beginning to orient us to the afternoon workshop phase. I think what we'll do is collect a few more questions on top of Professor Peng, so that we will end off with Sarah and James to respond. You won't be able to respond to everything, but this will be fertile ground, create more fertile ground for discussions in the afternoon. So any further? I have 3 already in view. I'll take 4.
You two next to you.
I got that. Okay, starting with Sujata. And please introduce yourself and make your question or comment brief.
I'm Sujata Papa. I am a Nepali student studying here in Talent Department. I just got back from Nepal and
can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay, so I think everyone heard my introduction.
Yes.
So my question and comment both is we heard from the morning how the government didn't have the ability to respond, and that we've been hearing that also in 1945, 1989, which was one of the victims of earthquake in Nepal, in eastern part of Nepal. But I have been rethinking about this, about how in this earthquake, I saw that there was a lot of agency among other Nepalis. I don't call it well-off at but taking forward this as a first responder, helping other Nepali through other relief efforts. Even my mom, who comes from rural eastern part of Nepal, she has nothing much to give, but they collected 15 truckloads of relief material to be sent to St. Departure district, which also included like supplies like medicine and 500,000 Nepali rupees. And I was thinking in that terms, a similar in Pokhara when I was there, a friend of mine who coordinated 500 volunteers when Nepal Army brought these victims from Barbak. And Nepal Army did a wonderful job at the time of as a first responder. And these Pokhara residents were responsible not only for hospital cleaning, but keeping the victim after victim was released from the hospital, or looking for the resources for the operation. So I was thinking about in that terms, how do we not only in terms of thinking about victim seeking agency, but also in terms of thinking in terms of how other people who come and take this agency and not necessarily through NGO but as an individual level and then bring forward. That was one question. And also we need to think humanitarianism in a very different context now. That's what I felt this time when I was in Nepal and talking to a lot of friends who've been involved, and even my mom was involved in collecting these resources.
Thank you.
My name is Yogesh Jha. I am a Nepali living in Toronto, and I work with Doctors Without Borders. And I was in Nepal during the twin earthquakes. Of course, I was on holiday mission, which turned out to be a disaster. So, both presenters did an outstanding comments, and my comment is a comment rather than a question here. I think humanitarian agencies, these are merely humanitarian work, or it's an industry. I think both. So, and when it's an industry, we need to be thinking about what's the funding source. We have been talking about, like both presentators mentioned, the nexus between government and NGO fundings, and this abruptly affects. And it's particularly, I want to present it as a scenario, like for funding and the primary response, and what should be and how it is actually today changing the landscape of operations of humanitarian sectors. So we need to be concerned about that the aid system too often moves slowly and inefficiently in response to rapidly evolving emergencies, particularly in instances of conflict. Of course, Nepal disaster was not a conflict, but things were obvious that things are not moving as tomorrow, in which humanitarians would focus more effort and resources on operations within prevention and resiliency framework, but we're missing something at the ground action during the first phases of when disaster or conflict strikes. I would like to present it as a situation it is analogous to a municipal investing in better fissures. Doing so, we don't simultaneously defund or lay off the fire department, or worse, divide its effects with a second mandate to install fireproof insulation while saving lives from burning buildings seems to be more important. So, are we
I'm gonna
lagging
stop
behind?
You. And I actually think, thank you. I have two more short questions or comments, Ritu, and then Kath, March. And then we'll come back to the panelists. Looks like we'll go another 10 minutes into lunch.
Do you have another question?
Got a graduate student back
We
here.
should put the graduate student first.
Hi, my name is Akshay. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Art here. My question is very short. Just want to ask Sarah if she could elaborate on the role of the Hindu religious organization in the post-earthquake relief and its role, if there is a role to be played here, in the broader restructuring that one laid out in your talk.
Thank you.
So I guess what I want to do is put on the table a word that is deployed quite a lot in development discourse, and I loved your distinction between development and conflict intervention. Whether, I'm not saying I'm behind this word, but I'm interested in whether sustainability is here part of the discourse in terms of conflict or emergency intervention. And the reason I asked and also then what does sustainability mean? So to take Sarah's really fantastic ethnographic work, on the Gavisa as opposed to Gaon, what I saw in your evidence was that this administrative structure of the Gavisa, which we understand is a kind of controlling governmentality, is also on the ground negotiable. And for me, the language of sustainability and development has always been channeled, at least since 1989, since the Washington Consensus, through the language of the rule of law. But in fact, it seems to me that your evidence is exposing the ways in which the enforcement of equitable rules, like your forest guy, right, your timber dude, in fact is inhabiting a domain of negotiability. That in fact, maybe we, instead of thinking about the rule of law as the ground for the sustainability, we might also be thinking about these techniques of negotiability on the ground. That's one point. And the other point that scares me, but that I thought was fascinating, was was this question of cash and voucher humanitarianism. And I wanted to see if you might talk a little bit more about, again, since the Washington Consensus, the explosion of global private law as opposed to global public law. I know that you've been working in global public law institutions, but in fact, it's global private law that has actually been generating perhaps the most sustainable changes in development discourse, and that also fortifies processes of financialization, cash, cell phone banking, the relationship between cell phone banking, the emergence of quote-unquote bottom billion capitalism, to use Ananya Roy's phrase, and the question of cash voucher transfers. How might we think of this in as a new marriage, perhaps, of different kinds of governing? Is the answer to conflict, or is it the new ground for thinking emergency intervention and conflict?
Kat?
I think I'll just take part in the discussions.
That's probably a great relief to the speakers. So could each of you respond as you wish?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Ito, for the very helpful comments. You asked how might this move beyond kind of individual mobilization of resources or individual negotiation of structures, right, to contribute to something larger. And I think that's hard to know at the moment, but the biggest issue, I would say, is sort of political movement fatigue among the people who we're talking about. The particular area that I'm detailing in Dolaka has a very long history as being a seat of early communist mobilization through the what's now the Unified Marxist-Leninist Party. Ironic, because that's now become a very conservative, regressive party at the forefront of promulgating this new constitution. But a lot of the people who I was talking about have sort of long-standing historical close relationships, party affiliations with that party, some with other parties. I know people are actively questioning what to do with that in the current moment, but they are significantly constrained by sort of a patronage system as well, where I think there are real fears that should they challenge those long-lasting affiliations, there might be other kinds of problems. At the same time, this area then became a base area for the Maoist movement in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That's something I've written about a lot elsewhere. And the thing about that, and in the longer version of the section on citizenship here, I talk in depth about how the women who were telling me about this had actually been involved in various ways in the Maoist movement. So they did participate in a large-scale revolutionary program oriented towards structural change. However, they now find themselves in the situation where that's over. The Maoists had their turn in power, the UFL are now in power, and yet very little of their individual aspirations seems to have been realized on the structural level. So I think for that reason, and I'm really glad the way you highlighted this, because it highlights what was kind of implicit, I think, in my work, is that I guess what I'm seeing is after the earthquakes, then a real kind of retrenching or turn towards sort of seconding resources as you. People don't know kind of what else to trust, but that's kind of oddly paired with this notion that I'm also talking with about increased political consciousness. Yeah. And I do think over the long term that people themselves will, I know that they already are trying to work through all that and figure out what to do, but at the moment at least, and I don't have the most up-to-date information, but at least in this area, there's not a wellspring of an alternative political movement. There are some in urban areas. I mean, people want to talk about Bibiksil, Nepal, right, or other kinds of parties. Baburam Bhattarai has the Maya Shakti party. There are kind of alternatives that are being posed, but they're just sort of, I think, in a formative moment right now. And just one quote I wanted to share from Mangoldai, who you showed, which I think really speaks to this. We were talking about, all of this and what had changed, and he said something like, which means the Maoists were unable to make us all equal. It's the earthquake that's been the great leveler, or has made us all equal. So I think that sort of addresses it. And then on the question of multiple citizenship, I mean, again, this is something that I've been talking about for a long time, that rather than being lacking citizenship, although we might see that as being the case in some formal ways, people in many of these contexts have found very strategic ways to sort of move beyond the constraints of what the state is unwilling to offer them in order to find that in other places, for instance, through migrant labor in India, of course, now further afield as well. So on the one hand, while the ID cards are just ID cards, I think at least they provide a kind of platform for the kind of negotiability that Rita was talking about. And just on that, I mean, of course, in my mind, the problem is what's the borderline between negotiability and corruption or nepotism, and that's always the issue, which I think is one of the really big ethnographic questions as well. And I found myself struggling with that, since the earthquake happened in terms of my own personal response. If I've got X amount of money, do I give it to the families that I've worked with closely, to whom I owe everything in terms of my own academic work and so forth, or do I distribute it in much smaller parcels to what? To 10 families, to the ward, to the VDC, and that's a really, really difficult question, and I think we all need to think a lot more about that. I mean, in terms of Hindu religious organizations, I don't actually have the detail about what has happened since then. That particular organization came in, stayed for a few days, cooked a lot of food, and left. I haven't heard about them coming back. However, there is a long history of this happening. I mean, for a long time there were flyers posted around this area, basically advertising spots for kids to go to boarding school in India, and if you dug a little deeper, it was clear that these were for basically schools affiliated with the RSS, and this is written about in many areas, tribal areas of India as well, and in other contexts. So I think we need to be watching that. Christian organizations are other ones to be watching too. Yeah.
So thinking about some of the questions, I kind of was thinking about for group answers for some of them. I think part of the thing that people are talking about in terms of planning and long-term thinking, I think one thing is whenever these kind of disasters happen, it's always chaos. For me, the international response was very fast in Nepal. Typically, it takes a lot longer for people to sort of come and arrive and set things up. I think there is always this huge, lack of coordination at the start, in particular. And for Nepal, the planning was already that people would expect that there would be hundreds of new NGOs that were coming who had never worked in the country before. I think part of the problem was also that the planning was for something to happen in an urban area, in Kathmandu, and there wasn't really the same sort of thought, any preparation for the areas that were actually hit by the earthquake. And I think part of it is also to do with kind of also sort of fundamental, more kind of deeper problems of how do you plan for something which might, in Nepal only happen every 70, 80 years. How do you get people to plan for something which may not happen again in their lifetimes? So I don't really have any sort of easy answers for that, but in some ways the coordination I saw in Nepal was better than in other areas. So, I mean, it's always kind of been a fundamental problem, and money doesn't help, but it's also the inability of people to organise and coordinate is also linked to other things as well. It's not just, I was a bit simplistic about the impact of money on changing relationships, basically. I think also sort of picking up some kind of theme and thing, I think I've had these discussions with kind of academics who study humanitarianism, that we need to be careful about how we think about humanitarianism, because it operates in different contexts, in different places, and for many people, the effects and the impacts of it are the thing that do keep them alive, and that includes international humanitarianism. So while I'm also very critical about, how it operates, I don't think that, I think it always needs to be unpacked and placed in a political context, and kind of the way that it works, and it might be very different for somebody who's in Syria, or somebody who's in Nepal, or somebody who's in Sudan. So a general sort of thing that I'm kind of thinking about, maybe a slight defence, a belated defence from me, and thinking about like the financialisation question is very interesting. I think it's linked to ideas of empowerment as well.
Yes, indeed.
I think in a way, like in the Nepal context, it made sense for the humanitarians because of it was this new thing and it's this new tool where you can suddenly give people the tools to spend money as they wish, but at the same time, it's not accompanied by a broader sense of redistribution.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not. That's the fundamental sort of thing I'm thinking about. That it's not, you know, in that context, and very specifically, you know, things I left out. There were attempts to get people to open up banking accounts to receive, you know, the latest tranche of reconstruction money.
It's a requirement.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, that directly linked to, and the World Bank was pushing that. So yeah, I'll end.
Yeah, one comment.
I want to talk about cash transfer. This is where I think where the merger of development thinking and the disaster response is happening. So where does this cash transfer idea comes from? But this is one of the probably the most popular sort of form of, you know, development policy now, actually promoted by organizations such as UNDP and the ILO and WHO. That has been really, really successful in Latin America. So I think it's a kind of probably slightly inappropriate transfer of policy ideas from one sector and region to another, thinking that this CTT might work in the case of Nepal as well.
So the 30-second
Yeah, no, just something really brief, and I meant to say this earlier too. I mean, I think it needs to be critiqued, but I think we should also look at how the cash transfer idea in Nepal introduced, or it really, I think, significantly, in some ways for the first time during the earthquake, has actually been seen as very welcome by many local people who have for years been saying, I mean, in this case, why give us CGI sheets? Moving them across the country and dealing with this politics of the bundle is huge. Give us the money and we'll be able to get what we need. And I mean, and there's been a huge local critique in this particular area too of like the World Food Program's Food for Work program and that kind of thing. And you know, I think there's both a positive and a negative side to be looked at.
I worry about finance being the new speech act. It happened with Citizens United, and it's actually been, you know, that's my intervention.
Okay, we need to eat.